call to order the Housing Task Force meeting of December 6th. Roll call, please.
Member Olson?
Here.
Murillo?
Here.
Lodge?
Here.
White?
Here.
Jordan?
Here.
Dominguez? And John Campanella is absent.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So changes to the agenda?
No.
Well, we do want to flip the items, the related items. We're going to be taking those in reverse order. The medium-high density in CBD first as sort of a planning issue, and then the phasing second. So that bit of change, let's see if we can take on. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the minutes. Any suggestions for changes on the minutes?
Move the minutes, Mr. Chair.
Motion, is there a second?
Second.
Motion by Murillo, second by Lodge for approval of the minutes. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Do we have any announcements?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. So now we have public comment. Are these two slips public comment for things not on the agenda or things on the agenda? Okay. So first of all is Mickey Flax.
I chose public comment because I know very little about parking, and I leave all of that to you experts, especially this everybody. I just want to remind you that the issue of...
Mic on there, Mickey.
Thank you. I want to remind you that the issue of what percentage of units, particularly in the high density priority development area, should be set aside for low income. And I've heard and seen in your questionnaire the figure of 10% bandied about. I would suggest that 15% is a more realistic figure in terms of the need, and is possible in terms of the penciling out. Often in the penciling out, we don't consider, as I noticed the economic consultants mentioned, the resale of the building. Developer builds it and then often sells it, either rented or unrented. And that sale represents a significant profit that is not considered in pro formas. So I think that there is room for a developer to make a reasonable profit, not a maximum profit, counting all of the income that he's likely to get, and still provide 15% affordable units, which also represents income. They're not zero. So that's when that discussion comes. I'm sure you'll be hearing more about it, but I just wanted to give you a heads up on that.
Okay, 15%. Thank you. Kathy McCammon, are you on, is this for materials not on the agenda or just for the agenda? Okay, so not on the agenda, then this is the time for that public comment.
Yeah, I'm not sure where this exactly fits, but I want to talk about mitigation fees. Recently, I had a chance to talk to some of the council members from Goleta, and they said they couldn't do anything without mitigation fees, whether it be for libraries, for parking, for roads, schools, other things. They have mitigation fees on all projects for all the different services their community needs. So that's it.
Okay, thank you. All right, so then that moves us to,
I have one actually that I was hoping to get in if I can. And it is not a topic on the agenda.
okay, great. Well, okay. Okay, Mr. Gray? Kathy, let's start.
Hi there, my name is Cameron Gray, speaking on behalf of Community Environmental Council. I was unable to attend the last Housing Task Force meeting. I understand that affordability requirements were on the agenda at that meeting. I want to state our organization's support for a 15% inclusionary ordinance requirement. We think that the 10% requirement is too low given the current need of the community, so we do support that 15% requirement and hope to see more discussion on that item either here or at City Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, Anna Marie Gott, and is this Pete Dalbello is giving you his time. So 4 minutes you have.
That's right. Housing Task Force and Chairman White. I wanted to remind everyone that the feasibility study that you guys have in front of you is based upon the current situation that we have with regards to taxes as well as feasibility for developers. And as you know, Congress is trying to, well, actually the GOP is trying to actually get substantial changes to taxes. And those taxes, if it actually goes through this so-called tax reform, is going to have substantial benefits for developers. And that will change the feasibility of this current study of projects in the future. And I believe that we need to, if that tax reform does actually go through, that we need to relook at the feasibility. Because what we are going to see as an increased tax cuts for pass-through entities, that will bring their current tax from 39.6% down to 25% for their taxable income. That's a substantial savings for them. It's going to create additional tax shelters for them here in the state of California. It's also going to shorten the depreciable life of a commercial assets from 39 years to 25 years. It's a big difference. And it's also going to have a big difference with regards to affordable housing, because the bonds for truly affordable housing are going to change. They're not going to be as, advantageous for developers or anyone else to actually invest in. More importantly, in all of this, we're really talking about affordable housing downtown. And how we actually eventually, get to that, we really need to look at our entire economy. Everyone's talking about bringing housing downtown, and that's great. It's a great fantasy, and the AIA, tried to paint a great fantasy for you guys yesterday in the City Council meeting. And it was beautiful buildings, gorgeous buildings, but they're not necessarily going to pencil out for the workers that work here. It's going to pencil out for a lot of people that want to move here. And it's not necessarily going to work for our current transportation system with regards to parking. Because if you start taking your parking structures and turning them into nighttime parking for the people in these AUD units, you are going to look at where are they going to park on the weekend? Are parking structures going to be filled with, residents on the weekends because they're only allowed to park at night, type of thing. So, there's a lot of things to think about, especially in the picture, which I understand. I didn't get any information from the AIA regarding the square footage, but Councilmember Dominguez brought up that the AIA was painting a picture of a $3 a square foot for rental units downtown. And to give you an idea, that $2,400 a month one bedroom at the Mark is $3.79 a square foot. And Councilmember Dominguez made the statement that, how is it that downtown's going to be less expensive than the Mark? It's not. So if you believed in AUD 1.0 with the AIA and all of their numbers, and look what we've got, imagine what AUD 2.0 and the AIA's numbers is actually going to look like. It's probably going to close to be $3,000, for a one bedroom. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so that moves us to our, continuing the agenda from last time. And let's see, staff, why don't you go ahead and read that first piece there then?
So, Mr. Chair, we're going to be talking next about parking and options the task force wants to recommend to council. Just by way of an introduction for that, this is a continuation from the November 8th meeting, but is also a continuation from May 27th. And transportation was asked to come to this meeting and give you our investigation of different parking options. And just as a reminder about that meeting and what we were saying, we were really asked by the council to look at parking primarily out of the challenge of having the community come forth and say there's not enough parking for AUD projects. And so that was what we were looking at when we looked at that. And as you may recall, or maybe you don't, I don't know, the general plan, when we did the general plan and we created the AUD, the staff recommendation and the planning commission recommendation was 1.5 spaces per unit for AUDs. The council went to 1 space per unit for AUDs, and that's proven to be a good incentive. And that's what we're really talking about, is how is parking an incentive for housing? So, and I'll cover that again in what we said on May 27th. But the other thing we found as a transportation staff, that when we looked at where are AUDs being constructed, we found that only 33% of the units were being constructed within the central business district. And the general plan, when we were updating it, that was the target for housing, was the downtown. So what transportation recognized in our analysis is that we weren't really getting the units we wanted in the downtown, but they were happening in other areas. Why was that? Well, what we discovered, and I think it seems obvious now, it seems like where did we miss it, is that downtown did not get a parking incentive. It has been 1 space per unit since 1998. And so while we brought the parking incentive down to 1 for AUDs everywhere else, we didn't really give an additional incentive to downtown, which was the target area. So it's no mystery we're getting these proposals in areas outside of downtown. When we were there on May 27th talking about this, we did bring what we considered to be demand requirements for housing to you. That's what our goal was. Council was saying, hey, let's have a housing task force and have them consider these parking issues. Staff is just responding and saying this is traditionally and what we've proven throughout history in Santa Barbara to be the parking demand for these locations. And this is what we suggested to you, is 1.5 spaces for units greater than 700 square feet, irrespective of bedroom count. So if they're less than 700 square feet and have and have 2 bedrooms, that'd be okay. But if they're 2 bedrooms, it would be 1.5 spaces. That's just simply demand. Staff is not saying do this or do that. We're just responding to, hey, this would meet demand. So we're not saying we recommended the task force that you increase the demand. There's other factors here at stake, and that is parking is an incentive for. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, but either I misheard or you didn't state what was up there, because what I just heard you say was that if it was less than 700 square feet and 2 bedrooms, that's okay.
Yes.
But up there, it says it's always 1.5 spaces for 2-bedroom units, regardless of square footage.
That's correct. So we need to make that nuance adjustment. We're saying
what you said is correct.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
So we're taking a note. Thank you for that. That's really good clarification. So again, we're talking about incentives for housing and where the housing should go, how many bedrooms it should have, that kind of thing. What the task force actually recommended on that day, back in May, was to Actually, that's not it. They recommended that we go and look and consider, see if we should do that for the purposes of making fewer bedrooms. Let me just make sure maybe these slides are backwards. They're not. So maybe I was looking at a slide practicing this, not there anymore. So the... It's slide 4. You sure? No? Okay. So there was a vote that had on this particular issue, and what the task force asked us to do was to come back and tell you if you actually made this change, what it would do to bedroom counts. And so I'm telling you now, if you do this and you change it from 1 and you increase the parking requirement, you will get less units over 700 square feet. You will get less 2-bedroom units because, as we've explained before, more parking requirement, the harder it is to do the project. Less parking requirement, the easier it is to do the project. And all developers, they come into transportation first. How many spaces do I have to provide? How am I going to fit them on the site? That is the biggest test. The more parking you have to provide, the more expensive a project is, the harder it is to get the buildings on the site.
Mr. Chair, so are you saying, Mr. Dayton, that we'll get fewer 2-bedroom, we'll get more 1-bedroom?
That's correct. If you raise the parking requirement, as we've suggested, to meet demand. If you leave it at 1, you'll probably get the same product you're already getting. And then, just to go over it, the two spaces is you've already suggested that for 3-bedroom units or more, a 2-space requirement be in place. So that's the question. Outside of the CBD, are we going to change the parking requirements? So you could talk about that now, or that one, and we could just talk about that, or I can move on to CBD and then take it all in total.
CBD piece. Let's do the CBD piece
Okay.
as well.
So
Hang on a sec. Let's start with questions on what Mr. Dayton just. Mr. Dominguez?
Do we have a summary of the data of how many units outside the CBD are 2 bedrooms versus 1 bedrooms?
Not available at the moment, but we could get that information for you.
Because I think-
Would you repeat your question, please?
Do we have a summary of how many units that are currently in the pipeline are 2 bedrooms or more versus 1 bedroom or studios? And do we have a goal in mind? Is there something in the general plan that says we should be shooting for twice as many 2 bedrooms versus 1 bedrooms and 12% 3 bedrooms? Because if we don't have a set of goals, if you don't know where you're going, any road will do.
I can get the information for you, but we don't have details right now.
Okay, because if we're off our goal of 2-bedroom units, then yeah, we want to make sure we don't reduce the parking incentives so much that people stop building 2 bedrooms. But if we're doing fine, maybe there's some room in the system. But without that data, we can't make a decision.
Mr. Chair,
Okay, Ms. Lodge?
I'm reading the Housing Task Force AUD report correctly. The number of 2-bedroom units total out of the 729 in the test program is 300.
So just a little less than half.
Yeah.
Okay.
And 1-bedrooms are 274.
But just to clarify, you wanted it inside and outside of the CBD as well. Okay.
Okay, Mr. Jordan?
So we need to wake Mr. Campanella up in another time zone for that answer, probably. So let me just pick on an architect, Brian Cornell. I hear him constantly through this process standing up and saying that the unit square footages could be smaller. And so if that's true, I'm assuming from his frame of reference is they could be smaller, they're still marketable, they would still work. So if that's true, why would an extra half a space per unit necessarily lead to less two bedrooms if there is square footage that you could erode from the units and still be marketable and work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So essentially what we did and what we showed you last time is that the same area is required for parking under the old requirements as is the footprint for the housing. It's equal. When the council moved it to one space per unit and essentially cut the amount of area required on a site in half that's required, that opened up a new territory of bringing projects in where you didn't have the parking underneath the housing. It could be alongside. It changed the size, bulk, and scale considerably. And the incentive is when you do that, the cost savings is significant. You don't have to build over parking. It's just surface parking with asphalt. It changes the doability considerably.
So
if we're going to add in,
it's not so much the parking; it's where the parking has to occur and the space it takes.
It's
up.
where
It's not
and
that you need that square footage. It has to be a particular place, and that drives that cost, right?
It does.
Okay. Thanks.
So any increases is gonna add cost, and then what I believe is true is developers will just go for the project that's cheaper to build, that may get a similar rent, and so that's probably what'll happen. You'll get less two bedrooms. You'll definitely get less three bedrooms because we went to two spaces for 3 bedrooms or more.
Okay. My other question, Pendy, you may know, or one of you guys may know too, is what's the actual status on the cap? Is that just still a recommendation that's gone to council? Has council started with that? What's troubling to me is we're deferring off again today from a prior conversation on the whatever we're calling the merit ranking. And some of these things are being taken a la carte, whereas to me these are potentially part of a package of merit rankings that would make one more meritable and move it to the top than less, rather than a blanket determination on projects that they go this way or that way depending upon what they do. So, anybody?
What do we know about the cap at this point?
Is the cap in process? Is it in place? Is it going to be in place?
Our attorney isn't here, but
I believe the Housing Task Force recommended that council
Okay.
approve a 125 cap per year at the permit level, but that has not gone to council
Okay.
and been approved
Well,
at this point.
and my recollection is that the council has passed a cap as a concept, but it has not become an ordinance. So there's that whole, next package that would need to be developed, a law written, and so forth and so on. And so we have this resolution in place, but we don't have the implementation piece as part of that.
Okay. So I guess, I would just say I'm uneasy in that we're pulling out these items a la carte when I thought they would be part of a discussion on a package of merits by which we would rank projects and they would move forward. For instance, if a guy had other components that overrode some of this, he might be more attractive than not. But this just puts everybody in the same category. So I don't really know how to resolve that because we're not going to talk about the merit thing today. We're pushing that off to another meeting. But this seems to be a little a la carte. So yeah, thank you.
So my question is that keeps getting raised is we have the nighttime parking. I guess maybe we'll wait till we get to the CBD stuff before we talk about nighttime parking. Okay. All right. Any other questions, Ms. Murillo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Coastal Housing Coalition on this subject says they oppose the requirement of 1.5 spaces for two-bedroom. The study admits an assumption that additional parking scenarios do not result in a loss of housing units. This is not realistic. even with this unrealistic assumption, the study documents too many development scenarios becoming marginally feasible with the increase in required parking. What's your comment on that? And did I just hear you say that changing the parking requirements will reduce the development potential?
That's our experience. The bottom line is that parking it really drives the process in many, many ways. And so with the more spaces, the developers are very commonly looking to provide less parking. Like without the requirements being lowered, they're saying, hey, can we provide less because of the costs?
So we're trying to decide whether to make a decision that will reduce housing production, essentially,
Right.
if we go for 1.5.
I think that that's true, and I think that the one perspective piece on that, and again, transportation staff doesn't necessarily, we don't have a recommendation either way. But what we found is that the housing is largely being built in a place where it wasn't planned. I mean, it was allowed. I remember being there with John and Betty, and we said, okay, downtown. And then we said, well, how much further could we go? That was the question. It's downtown is where we wanted the housing, but how much further could we go out? And so we talked about the transportation relationships of positioning housing further outside of the CBD, and we allowed for that. We suggested to Planning Commission and Council that that's what you do, and we did that. The thing that we didn't count on is that the parking incentive would be so influential. And when we were making that recommendation, it wasn't 1, it was 1.5. It was later when council made the kind of a compromising to get everyone on board on the same page to go to 1. So the 1 actually was never even considered in the context of the going beyond the CBD. So what we are recommending, transportation staff is recommending, is downtown. You should consider a parking incentive so that we get the housing construction moving to that location. And then what you do in the outside of CBD is really a balance between the neighborhoods who are having concerns with the amount of parking in the neighborhoods, which transportation has firsthand knowledge of. When we were out at the Mitchell Traina, when the bike lanes were being proposed for Mitchell Traina, we really found out how that those neighborhoods are really challenged and really feel passionately about the parking issues, and that's where some of our appeals have happened, right in that same neighborhood.
So when you say that the CBD is still at 1 space.
It is, and then we're going to talk about in the next item, should that be lower?
Giving them more incentive, you mean?
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Dayton.
Just to add to that, in the studies, they did take a look at outside the CBD in terms of the added parking requirement of 1.5 spaces, and it did reduce the return on cost depending on how you went about incorporating that extra parking requirement. They looked at stackers, conventional parking, and there was a move on the return in addition to the fact that you could lose some housing. So it's both the return and the potential to lose some units if you increase the parking requirement.
But we have so few certificates of occupancy, so you're making assumptions, Mr. Rowell and Mr. Dayton, about these projects that are in the pipeline, I guess?
Yeah, it's a review of a pro forma and some of the projects in the pipeline, and anytime you raise a parking requirement, you will reduce the return for the developer on that project, and you could run the risk of having less units provided in that project as well.
And then I would say, I think it's a separate, we have a lot of AUDs who are already in, and they're designed, and they're at different places in the process. It's a different discussion, which is on this agenda, is when would you grandfather in changes in the AUD? And so that's another part of the conversation. But
Well, we had a vote on that, and that was, we picked a date sometime in September when that was the cutoff, and the projects that were in the pipeline would not be subject to these changes. I'm remembering that vote very clearly.
I believe that was related to the cap, the 125 cap. We can go back and check the minutes. But
I think you should go back and check. I remember Mr. Olson specifically saying that these were the rules, these were the parameters. People put their investment portfolio together. They did design and went through the process expecting these were the rules, these were what they were offering. And so that is what you mean by this grandfathering in today. Yeah, we talked about that a month ago, too.
Okay, so Mr. Dominguez has a question. Did you have another question?
Well, just a comment on this. The vote, I think it was September 13th, the vote was to apply the, for the metering, was to start on September 13th for projects. Everything that was already in the pipeline would be covered on the basis of, as you said, Ms. Murillo, fairness to the developer. My question is, what about fairness to the community? This program was designed to, on the basis of what the developers and architects and so on told the council in August of 2011, that these projects would come in at rents that were really affordable, starting at $1,200 a month. Well, we haven't seen anything like it. And we're not getting any. It was to provide the affordable housing, small a affordable, and we're not getting it. And what we're getting instead is more demand for low-cost housing generated by the new residents in Santa Barbara. That's what that's what the Nexus study showed.
Right, and I keep
That's
saying
the history, yeah. So
that we all have to take responsibility for that. We thought there would be affordability, but when you talk about a benefit to the community needs more housing units.
Okay.
So
And
that's the other side of it.
right,
Is
and,
that
and we'll have our chance to get in on the comments and advocate for that. But let's finish up with questions here.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
then
Chair.
We'll move on. Okay, Mr. Dominguez.
So I agree with everything Mr. Dayton said, but I just want to add in a few points that you probably agree with, but give a fuller answer to the question regarding the.
And we have questions at this point.
And at the end of this statement, it's going to be, is this true or false? And let him make sure that this should be part of his answer. But because our job are to be the adults in the room. We don't want to just keep giving developers freebies and windfalls without a consummate community benefit in hand. So when you talk about parking, there's a curve. In fact, builders won't build a building with no parking if it's going to stop renters from renting the building, right? And we saw that with the Mark. They put in more than was required by the city. So there's a certain minimum that every builder is going to want to build because they want people to want to park there. And the problem we have, particularly with the Milpas area, and if you don't believe me, go walk around Ortega Park and the two big developments going up on Salinas that are not Salinas, South Cipuedes that are underparked. Go try to park there during the day or at night. Every other time of reality, you can park there, just not day or night. So there's a huge problem. And when you add parking, that could cause a project to be less feasible. That's absolutely right, but it doesn't always. And our expert from KMA indicated that there's elasticity in the market. If there's a parcel for sale for $1 million and it's not worth developing, but you take away the parking requirements, then it may be, but that means the price of the property actually goes up. So who benefits in that situation? Well, the property owner, not the developer, not the renters, not the community, the property owner. And again, this isn't any kind of problem with property owners, but we want to make sure we don't vote on things here that all it does is increase the property value, which only benefits the property owner. We want everyone to be in partnership here. So when you look at these parking spots, I want to make sure we understand all of these economic factors, all the incentives and who's incentivized and who benefits. And it hasn't been the tenants, which was the whole point of AUD. So I just want to make sure that that's something we're all aware of, or if there's any problems with that, I'd want to know now before we move forward with this. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, right. It's just, I'm sorry that's spirit is not followed there. Okay. So we're moving on to, from after those questions, Mr. Dayton, you're moving on to the next piece of your presentation?
So then the next thought was, so that was outside of the central business district. What about inside the central business district? And the question is, an in lieu fee, adoptive parking in lieu fee. What the task force voted on May 27th was to increase parking incentives for housing within the CBD, to consider parking maximums or parking in lieu fees, and to manage downtown parking facilities to allow residential use within the facilities. So that vote passed 6-0. Then the question becomes, what should the in lieu fee be? And you know, I think the recommendation is 10,000 a space, which is fine. What we would use, just to let you know what downtown parking and transportation would be using the fee for, is we would use the fee for specifically to, if you recall, we talked about the downtown parking system and the 3,300 parking spaces in the downtown parking system that are unutilized in the evening, then no one's parking there in the evening. How would we have residents parking there at night but still guard the customer parking during the day? And the answer to that question is that, and how we would use the in lieu fee is we would change the system in the parking garage to be a closed loop system. It's not closed loop now. What happens now is the gates go up at 11 p.m. and people can go out. If they're still there, they go out for free. The gates go down at around 7 o'clock in the morning. And then after that, you have to pull a ticket. So the gate would be down in the closed loop system 24/7, and the rate structure would change based on the hours and the demand. So the rate structure per hour during the day is much higher, and in the evening it would be very much less, possibly even free. And so what we would do is we would make it hard for a resident who doesn't use their car and they just want to store it to be very expensive. That's the point there. When we talk about putting housing downtown, and someone who spoke in public comment talked about workers, we're trying to get people who live and work in the downtown for the best. That was the general plan strategy. Live and work in the downtown. And what we found in there is that if you do live in the downtown, you're 90% likely to not even leave the city for work. That's a pretty high statistic. That's the current statistic now. So you only have 10% of the people leaving the city limits if they're living in the downtown, leaving the city limits to work. So if someone is going to live downtown, and let's say a developer only provides a very marginal amount of parking and pays the in lieu fee, and then the resident has the option to come to downtown parking because they really, really, really have to have a car, there's going to be a tension there for them not to. We want to keep the tension, and we want to be able to adjust the tension. We don't want to guarantee someone a space in perpetuity in our garages because we don't know what the future is going to hold. So, and it's preferable for us to say, look, and this is what we say to employees, if you come downtown and you're going to park within the downtown area, it's going to be hard. You're probably going to get a ticket, or you're going to pay a lot of money because we don't want you parking in the customer parking. The same would be true for residential. If you're going to live downtown, we've designed it so that you don't need your car. We've got rental facilities. When you do need a car on demand, you can have one. It's not like we're taking your car keys away. But we have a transportation issue, and we have limited capacity in our city to grow, and this is the way we want to grow. So we want to have that option to keep the tension if they do use the parking facilities in the lots, that it will price them out if they keep it there all 24/7. It'll be more like a high-end storage cost.
So to get back to, and Ms. McCammon, I think, raised it, what do you see happening to the worker's vehicle that who uses the facility at night? Where does that car go during the day?
Well, it would work.
Just trying to make them get rid of the car. I mean, that's what I heard. Just what you just said, but what?
Well, we wouldn't force anyone to do anything, but we'd price it so that there's tension. So if you, let's just say you had a job in Goleta, maybe it'll work out really great for you.
Okay.
You're parking at a very low cost during the evening because there's very little demand in the lot. Let's say none right now. And then during the day, you leave and you avoid the high cost of keeping your car there, and you're going to your job in Goleta, and on your days off, you may pay a lot of money, and Saturdays and Sundays, you're going to pay a lot of money.
But that's the 10%. We're talking the 90%. The 10% of the people who live downtown work somewhere else.
Right.
The other 90% work downtown. Live and work downtown.
And the tension.
So what happens to that car during the day?
So they're either going to pay for it, having it in the lot, and we have room for that, specifically in lots 10 and 6. Granada Garage is 6. The Ortega Garage is 10, and I can show you the capacities. I happen to have a slide on that. We have 30% capacity all the time during the day, which is a lot of spaces. So we have the room. In the future, with autonomous vehicles, if everyone in the government and with the people who are investing in them are correct, we probably won't need as many spaces for parking in our system in the future anyway.
All right, thank you. All right. So then at least the report that we got, backing up to the previous slide.
Yeah, and then the last thing that you voted on is the citywide parking management. This was a 6-0 vote. Protect neighborhoods from and maximize parking options citywide. Exclude AUD projects from residential parking permits. That's downtown in the residential parking permit district. So any housing unit would not be available to get a parking permit in the downtown. Require unbundled parking to allow residents to choose the parking they need. So developers would not assign spaces. They would rent them separately with the ones that they do build in the CBD. And then monitor and expand car share as warranted. And that was 6-0. So you have options on those two things. You could just go with the vote you already did at 6-0 and then decide on the amount of the in lieu fee, or you could reopen the discussion.
Excuse me. Okay. Questions on that? Wilson?
Mr. Dayton, is it feasible to waive the fee or reduce the fee if the tenants don't have cars?
It is possible to do that in a rental situation. So the time when the fee would be paid would be at building permit. So so the timing's a little strange. You don't know your renters, and then of course as the renters change, they may or may not have vehicles.
Well, they'd have to run that through David or one of your staff people.
And there are ways, and the housing authority has done it, so to take preference over people who do not have vehicles. Yeah. The fee would be used to support the fact that they don't have a parking space in the downtown.
Right.
So building that in and building that support across the board may be important to support developers not building spaces.
But I would think that what I believe you're alluding to, for example, is even the Casas de las Fuentes,
That's
maybe, where the housing authority is the landlord. Whereas, are we going to be bringing in landlords, private developer landlords? Are they getting folded into this system, and then year in and year out they're doing that? That's a tougher nut.
I don't think it would work.
Okay, all right, thanks. Ms. Murillo, do you have questions?
So we're discussing the $10,000 space?
Yeah, and just
Okay.
this in lieu fee and
Okay.
yeah.
So the Coalition for Sustainable Transportation, they're recommending 20,000. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Dayton? I think that's an
I
incentive.
think that that's a really good question. And
I mean, you're not the consultant, but
right, and the consultant talked about that either would work. I think the challenge is, for a transportation perspective, we run the numbers, approximately how many units we would hope would be built by the 10,000. We feel like it's well enough money to close the system in the garages and start implementing more stronger alternative transportation promotions in the downtown. I think that the challenge is, from a transportation perspective and from a planning perspective, is we need housing downtown. And it's almost like, as we've talked about this in staff, it's almost like what happened with council in the one space. You just try something and see if the housing starts flowing, and then if it's flowing too much, adjust the faucet, like this committee's tasked with. And so I wouldn't want to start high. I would want to start low and go higher.
so this could be something that we put under the adaptive management
That's correct.
list to revisit. But isn't it really, you keep talking about housing downtown, it's the density level category, right?
another
That's
piece of
really
it.
the driver.
It's
mostly,
both.
'cause- yeah.
It's both the parking and the density.
Because CBD's at medium high. Do I have
A lot
that
of
right?
it is. A lot of it
lot
is.
of it
Not
is.
the center of the donut hole, but yes, as it's affectionately referred to.
Okay.
Just to add a little to that, the consultant was fine with the $20,000 per space, but it did make the return on cost very close to marginal. And he recognized we're trying to incent business in the central business district, so that's why they're recommending $10,000 per space.
Right, because we might be putting pressure somewhere else.
Correct.
And so 10 sounds good at this
Yes.
point. Okay, thanks.
Ms. Lodge, any questions? No. Okay. Jordan?
So the in lieu fee would be a fee to, in theory, recoup the cost to the parking structures to retool.
To retool the operations,
Right?
yes.
So it'd have a direct nexus to what would have to be done. Okay. And then on top of that, you would still charge a tenant who needed to put a car in there, you would still have a rate that's daily, weekly, monthly, something on top of that, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So you're talking about doing this in the absolute most expensive real estate in the city, right? And my recollection, I think the consultant, he was questioned on this too, his comparables were terrible because nothing's sold down there, basically. And so everything down there, in my perception, is multi-generational pre-Prop 13. And so when you put all that into a bucket and shake it around, how do you end up actually saying you're incentivizing? How do you not end up saying you're disincentivizing by putting another fee on top of a price of land that's already the most expensive, that has no good recent sales history, and that all works into the mix of the pro forma? So can you help me with that uneasiness?
Well, I could start and maybe David follow up. But when the AIA did their recent charrette, I attended a pre-prompt meeting where I shared some thoughts on transportation, and there was some developers in the room who also shared. And their big message is no one's going to be taking away commercial for housing. That does not pencil out. But they will be adding housing to their existing commercial. That's how it does pencil out. And so parking becomes a challenge, because if you're all built out and you don't have any access, and transportation is not going to let you have a driveway off State Street anyway, how do you do it? And the answer to that question is you do it without parking, or very, very minimal parking that's parked within 1,250 feet, which is also allowed if it's it runs with the land. And then you run the numbers on the costs. For Granada Garage, which was a long time ago, it cost us $45,000 a space, and that's not including the land cost. So that cost is, I think actually the consultant looked at something like that, but it's, was it 60 now, or
Well, the consultant looked at the in lieu fees in comparison to stackers, in comparison to conventional parking, and even an in lieu fee at $20,000 was better economically for the developer than the stacker option.
Yeah, but I guess my worry about this is when he's doing the math, he's using an assumptive number for the land cost. And so you could correct me again, but there's a ton of properties that I know up and down and into the funk zone that are multi-generational, could have been developed, old families in Santa Barbara that just don't want to hassle it. And so the math seems to be as if a family name starting with C that's been here a long time just says, well, all of a sudden, I'd like to go through a couple years of development hell to do it, when that hasn't been the case in the past. So the property would probably have to change hands, and all of a sudden there would be a huge step-up price in the cost of that property going into the math, which isn't demonstrated in the consultant's report because he has no historical comparables.
He did make a comment in the CDBG that the land costs were significantly higher, and he did not have, as you pointed out, many comparables, and that's why his recommendation was to raise the density level in the central business district to offset some of the higher land costs.
I guess I'm just looking for more certainty based on the last couple of years, and there's never any certainty, right?
Well, and I think it's good. I think it adds to the what's the right price for an in lieu fee, and then just to play that out and how that's structured, just so we all talk about the same thing. When we came to you last, well, at least in May, we were talking about parking maximums or in lieu fee. So how that works is the parking in lieu fee is you keep the requirement at one space per unit, and then the developer buys down the requirement. So, you think of a 30-unit place is 10,000 a space. You can kind of do the math and see how it would play out. But again, I think 20, 10, 5. I think we're all don't have enough information to know what people are going to buy it at. We just know that we want them to, and we want them to do it downtown.
Okay, Mr. Dominguez, any questions?
Mr. White.
Let's come back around.
So I'm curious, when we talk about incentivizing developers, what makes us so sure that we have that power, that someone's not looking at, hey, I can develop something in Bakersfield, Ventura, San Francisco and make 20% versus 10% here? In other words, we can put bags of gold out on the table and they still may not want to develop. Is there any study or any theory we have that shows why economic incentives are going to help developers want to build here in a built-out city?
My only answer is that's why I'm here. I'm not leaving Bakersfield. Yeah, I don't think we know the answer to that question, Mr. Dominguez. It's a question of like why, and I think it's back to Mr. Rao's point, is that we often find developers who have land in the family who are doing these projects, and they're already here, and they don't have land anywhere else, and so that's why they're doing it. But I think it's fair. Like, it's just like with AUD. We didn't know what was going to work, and we had to put something out there to see what would happen.
And I asked the question yesterday, and I didn't get a dispositive answer, but Chapala has the red cross-hatched AUD, which means it's the highest density development. There's only one project going in Chapala. So here we are putting all of our eggs in this downtown basket, saying, oh, let's incentivize them, take away their parking requirement, charge a minimal fee, and then they're all going to build residential. But no one's built residential in Chapala except for the one unit, I think, down in the 400 block, and you've got the entire Chapala except for one block is available. From the freeway where Lily's Tacos is all the way up to, I think, Sola. There hasn't been a single AUD project on Chapala, and that's the heart of the central business district. It's, other than State Street, that's as hard as you get. And there's a ton of property on Chapala, for anyone who's walked along Chapala, that's really underutilized. So I think we need to study why Chapala hasn't been incentivized enough where people are building. Maybe we'll have an answer.
Ms. Brooke?
Mr. Chair and committee members, task force members, thank you. I did hear your question yesterday. Wasn't there to answer it for you, but So I thought about that when you did ask that question, and as I was mentally walking myself up and down Chapala, I think there's several reasons why we might not be seeing AUD projects. There are several parcels on the lower part, up to the 700 block of Chapala, that have recently redeveloped, somewhat recently, with condo projects. So we have Chapala 1, Paseo Chapala. There's another condo project by Jeff Shelton, all on the west side of Chapala Street. On the east side, we have Paseo Nuevo that takes up 2 blocks of Chapala. Above Carrillo, we have city-owned parking lot, MTD. So I think there's some reasons why, although it's noted in the map as a priority overlay area, there's reasons why we're not seeing it come in to the AUD program. Sonos also recently acquired some of those properties and have, refurbished them for their use. That does still leave some others, and so your question's valid. But there are other properties that are tied up either in recent redevelopment or are government-owned that would, not be necessarily upfront for redevelopment.
And there is one condo project on the southeast side of Chapala there, the Burkus project that's sort of by D'Angelo's bakery there. And all that.
Mr. Chair,
Okay.
excuse me, there
I know
is.
Mr. Olson
Oh,
was
oh.
next, and then.
Well, I still have some questions. I wanted, if someone wanted to comment on this point, I'm happy to deal with it all at once.
Could I answer? So I think what the study found that we just did found that it's not economically viable to do that. So we have the conclusions, and I think what we're suggesting is that if you do the incentive of parking and having an in lieu fee, and so, for instance,
Right, I just understand. My question is, at what point do we give up on one more thing and then they'll develop one more thing? Because we say, oh, the donut, but then you got Chapala, which is not part of the donut hole, it's part of the donut, and no one's building there. So fill in State Street, but I'm not a betting person, but I'm not going to put money that turning State Street into red hatched AUD, meaning the highest density, is going to change people's calculus, particularly as Mr. Jordan points out. That property is even more expensive than Chapala, I'm guessing. Does anyone know, is State Street more or less than Chapala? I'm guessing it's more.
and you're required to put in 1 space per unit.
So again, I want policies that are based on positive experiences in our community or other communities, not based on hopes, optimisms, and miracles. So that's why I want to study, why is Chapala not being developed? And I understand you got to look parcel by parcel, but there's a motorcycle store down there, a Honda motorcycle store. Anyone been in there? I went in there once when I was waiting for a table at D'Angelo's. The latest motorcycle they had was like a 2015. So the next time I was there, like 6 months later, I was kind of curious. Let me go to see if they've like refreshed their inventory. No, it's like the same 6 motorcycles. And this is the heart of our town, and there's a motorcycle store there that's apparently not selling motorcycles. So to me, there's a lot of mysteries that need to be solved before we roll the dice and gamble on a theory that we don't have any evidence is really going to work. So the other questions I have is we have these other options. I think if you go back to the other slide, some other parking solutions, like transitional parking. One of the ideas I've talked about is if someone's building a particularly big project, can we have a parking lot across the street that we can use in the short term, 5-10 years? Because a lot of people are speculating that parking needs are going to drop with autonomous driving. So can we have people commit to a temporary lot? And then ideally, once we hit that level of technological sophistication that people aren't driving cars on a daily basis, then we can turn that lot into housing. But if we marble in 1.5 spots per unit, we're forever losing that ground space in Santa Barbara. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And that is allowed right now. 1,250 feet is allowed, and you can have parking that's remote. We have a policy for it in the general plan, and I don't think that's, as long as it runs with the land. And then when the parking demand goes way down, then the developer can come in and say, hey, everything's changed. I don't need the parking. I'd like to build housing over this now. That can happen.
Right, and that seems more like outside the CBD. That's something we should really focus on. Because inside the CBD, it looks like we're focusing that, but with existing parking lots, because we have definitely the nighttime capacity. Great, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Olson.
Thank you, Chair White. Back to the in lieu fee. As I understand it, properties within the central business district that are within the parking district area, mapped areas, they pay a fee, an annual fee to the city, to the parking district. Is that correct?
It's a business improvement district for parking, so there are about 1,000 businesses that pay into it based on their revenue, sales, and their proximity to parking and how much parking they're providing on site. It's a pretty complicated formula, but they pay into to the tune of about $1 million a year total for the operations of the downtown parking district.
So it's based on the revenue.
Based on the revenue, if they have parking, and how close they are to parking supplies that are provided publicly.
Zone of benefit.
Revenue from rental housing units wouldn't necessarily apply to that.
Yeah, they wouldn't. We wouldn't be assessing anybody who wouldn't be making money. We don't assess residents, no. So there's plenty of residents now, not plenty, need more, but within the parking district, and they don't pay an assessment. And also offices, ironically, don't pay as much as, say, a fast food, based on your revenue and your sales generation.
Ms. Lodge?
Just for general information, there is one project on Chapala, somewhere between 20 and 30 units across the street from Chapala 1. I think it's been approved by ABR. HLC.
All right. Okay.
It's the property with a small building with some offices at the back of it currently.
Correct. That's 414 Chapala, and I believe Mr. Dominguez alluded to that one, right?
Okay, good. All right, Ms. Murillo had another question? No? Okay. All right, so I'll open this up for public comment then, and starting with Kathy McCammon, and to be followed by Cameron Gray.
I have several questions. First of all, has the City Council ever decided the goal of having housing in the CBD? Or was that part of the general plan to have this housing there? Because it seems we need to decide if that really is where we want the housing, because there was a reason for the donut hole. That was different conflicting objectives, such as protecting historical resources and other possible conflicts.
Okay.
So that's why the donut hole originally started. So then moving on from there, we just heard a little bit about who already is paying in for the parking, because it seems like we're talking about giving away or incentivizing what is public parking is already a community benefit. And we're not even sure, as Mr. Dominguez pointed out, that all the incentives in the world will make this better. So I think we need to step back and see if this really is the goal, or if the housing could be on the other streets rather than on State Street, which is the most expensive land. And it sounds like we're bringing all these problems about what we're going to charge, what we're going to do for in lieu fees, and we don't even know that this is where we want the affordable housing, if it will be affordable, and if people will develop it or people will want to live there. Then when you get to parking, short of a contract saying you won't have a car, with rentals, you don't know it up front. If they're going to have a car, they're going to have two cars, and other than DMB, no one really knows about the cars, because people could have cars and just park them somewhere else.
Okay, thank you.
So anyway,
Next is Cameron
you've
Gray.
got my comments.
Yes. Cameron Gray.
Hi again, Cameron Gray with Community Environmental Council. First of all, I want to thank you. This is incredibly complex. We're really, I think, trying to thread the needle here and strike the right balance along a lot of competing issues. So just recognizing the work you're doing on that. I think Mr. Dayton, what I heard him say is that if we increase parking requirements outside of the CBD, we're essentially going to see less development. And I think it's really important to put a frame around this of like, we are in a housing crisis right now. I really question whether we want to impose additional parking requirements if that's going to reduce the overall supply of housing. I see the need to kind of, again, strike the right balance here, but it's a question that I have. And then with regard to the interactions here, I think Commissioner Jordan had raised the point that we're talking about a lot of these issues in isolation. And I think that there are interactions between the parking requirements and things like the inclusionary requirements that we're discussing. And I think if we're going to have these discussions, we need to be really clear on what our top priorities are. I would say that for Community Environmental Council, the top priorities are going to be inclusionary requirements and really getting the supply of housing in this community up, because we have a major issue with regional commuting that is causing, large-scale greenhouse gas emissions locally. With regard to the central business district discussion, the in-lieu parking fee there, I think we're open to a range of $10,000 to $20,000. Really kind of, again, trying to strike the right balance here. I leave it to the experts to figure out what number is going to be right. And then with the question of incentivizing development in the central business district, I have a question of whether it's really a fixed pie scenario. I think if developers are given an opportunity to develop here and then they have other opportunities in other localities, that they will do it all if it is financially beneficial. So I do think we can incentivize development here, and we really are supporting the policies that will help that happen. So I thank you very much for your consideration of the comments.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Lucas Zucker, followed by Ellen Bildstein.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having the time for us to give comment. I just wanted to speak a little bit on the parking requirement. At the last task force meeting, mentioned Cause is supportive of keeping the parking requirement at 1 rather than 1.5. And that's both because we're concerned about environmental issues and getting people out of their cars, but also really looking at affordability, which is our biggest concern. And we know that there's always going to be a trade-off, right? That when we're crafting these policies, there are things like raising parking requirements and requiring more developers to pay for more below market rate units and affordable housing and pay into our transportation system. Those things are going to have a cost to developers. I think they're capable and somewhat willing to pay some of those costs, right? Of course, we know they're not going to pay everything, right? And so we need to think about what we want to prioritize most. To me, echoing what Cameron said from Community Environmental Council, I think the biggest priority for a lot of folks is affordability, making sure that we're having kind of workforce housing at all levels of affordability here in Santa Barbara. And so, to me, to choose between the trade-offs between parking requirements and inclusionary housing is to choose between cars and people. And I think that we need to have the highest level of inclusionary housing requirement. And if that means that we need to have, keep the parking requirement as it is, then I think that's, the important thing is that we have as many affordable units as possible.
Question for the speaker.
Okay.
Why do you think that it's this dichotomy between parking and affordability?
Sure, and I think we can do both on some level. Obviously, we wouldn't want to have zero parking requirements.
Right, but what's the evidence that you have to choose between one or the other, even partially?
Just that both cost developers money, right?
No, it costs the property owner money, not the developer. They come in with a 10% pro forma or 5% or 20%, whatever profit they want to make. They have to acquire the land.
Sure.
And so the property owner will raise the price if they know that it's going to be more profitable for the developer. And
That's
again,
right.
there's options we can make, like off-site parking, that don't cost anything in the long term. It's a short-term cost, but then we have even more dense, fewer parking spots if we go with that solution. So I wish you guys would maybe push for that third path where we win both, a win-win. We get more affordability and better traffic control, because the problem is if people are not able to park in their building and they're parking down the street, you're going to have a lot more traffic accidents. Pedestrians and bicyclists are going to suffer if people are constantly circling looking for parking. Thank you.
Sure, and that's why I think that we do need the highest level possible of in lieu fees, so that we're getting funding to improve our active and public transportation network, and actually making that work. And I think it is a good point that inclusionary housing requirements and these other requirements do lower, as the consultant actually mentioned, when he was giving his presentation, they lower the price that developers are able to get for the land, because landowners know that, and so I think it's true, and it's an important point that I think that developers can pay for more inclusionary housing and these other investments in our community than we often think at first glance.
Thank you. All right, Ellen Bilstein to be followed by John Fowler.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I wanted to follow on the presentation that was made yesterday to City Council regarding the State Street charrette that the AIA put on, and there was this booklet that was put together that maybe many of you are aware of, and if you're not, there's an opportunity to get a copy of this, which summarizes the results of the charrette that we had back on October 21st. There were a lot of interesting outcomes, I think, from the studies that the architects made on that day during the charrette that have very direct connection to what's being discussed here regarding the in lieu fees. Housing and really figuring out how to better utilize some of the blocks that are immediately adjacent to State Street. We've found that there are actually a lot of open areas and lots that are being used for surface parking and probably not to their best use. There were some studies done, just as an example page of, one of the team solutions, sort of analyzing what the figure and ground comparison are on some of those blocks along State Street, and just the opportunity to be in favor of in lieu parking so that we can reduce the required parking on housing that could be the newest version of AUD and address things that have maybe been troublesome about the AUD that surrounds the central business district, to be more inclusionary, to drive down the requirement for parking, and really address our workforce needs at all different levels of affordability. So just wanted to raise that point, and thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dominguez?
Is that available on your website? You mentioned it was available.
It is, yes.
And is it something that we could put on our Housing Task Force website?
I'll check in and see. I would imagine we're very much about sharing the information.
Great,
so.
and thank you all very much for doing that workshop. It was awesome.
Great, thanks.
Great. Fowler?
Good afternoon, John Fowler, People Self-Help Housing. And I just wanted to cover a couple of things, but just talking about, we are a developer. We run by the same things as any other for-profit. It's just that we're a nonprofit, but we have to pay for land costs and all the other things. So we know all the drivers about parking cost and what you're saying. So I would say, first of all, just I agree with most of what Mr. Dalton has said, except I am from Bakersfield, so anyhow. But there is a reason why it is cost, and they're not having these discussions in Bakersfield because it is cost and it is land cost and what have you. But so the parking in lieu, it is too low, and obviously it's not going to cover the $45,000 it costs to do the structure and those kind of things. What is the right number? Be happy to have some discussions, even provide some information to staff on that. But it's not a deal breaker. Really, you're talking about parking costs once you've decided to do the project. You throw it in there, but it's like, can I make the parking work based on what we're doing? We don't, you sort of look at, is this a great place to be? Is this where traffic is? Where all the transit and what have you. So parking is a big part of probably what's happening in the AUD areas, and why it's not happening, but it's also the land cost is high there. And, people are sitting on lots, as you suggested. There's zoning issues, there's density issues, it's cost, it's economics, and that's what's driving this. And so when you start to talk about, at what point do we incentivize and how far? Well, until you get there, until you get something that makes the AUD work. And so you've got to keep throwing stuff out there, and you've got to keep trying and looking at density, looking at in-lieu fees, looking at all those kinds of things. So you need to keep working at this. Higher cost is, I just want to say, it's economics. We look at a site, we would go build in the AUD if we could make the land costs and the parking and the in-lieu. I mean, it's looking at all those things. So what are you trying to do? Are you trying to get low cost housing? Or are you trying to get housing or all kinds of housing? So it will depend on where you're going to push this and what variables. We work with variables every day trying to figure out how do you make it work? What is the perfect number? And we've got all kinds to work with. I think the in-lieu fee is a good thing. It's flexible. It means that you can get a project that's commercially zoned and doesn't have parking and ability to get off of State Street. So anyhow, it's a great discussion, and I think that we have to realize there are many drivers and many different things we're talking about, whether we're trying to do. But I do think the logic of in the outer areas, if you want to drive housing outside of the area, then drive up the parking, and it's going to hopefully make people look but more interior. But we'd also realize we want affordable housing everywhere, not just downtown. I mean, we want more housing, period, right, in all areas. So depending on what you're trying to incentivize. All right, thank you.
Yes, I am. Okay, Housing Task Force members and chair. We looked at the AIA's plan yesterday, and of course we've got again the Housing Task Force Nexus and feasibility study that we're looking at today. And I just want to, you to keep both of those things in mind when, Rob Dayton went to the meeting for the pre-charrette. You said that commercial, owners, or at least the developers, basically said that that owners won't take commercial off the table in terms of residential units. They were not going to go ahead and take their commercial space down and only have residentials. That's basically what I'm hearing. Is that right? It didn't pencil out. Well, one of the things that I sent everyone here today for this meeting was some references to a San Diego study from 2015 from the San Diego Housing Commission. They looked at 11 different ways to bring housing costs down. And one of the things that they discovered was that when you have a mixed-use building and you have commercial on the first floor, that lenders, it was actually costing people more and more money, because guess what? Lenders recognize that it's getting harder and harder to actually rent out commercial space. When that happens, that risk goes up. And when that risk goes up, the other parts of the project actually end up subsidizing for that space that you now have empty. From San Diego to San Francisco, we have mixed-use projects, and we've got one right up on, State Street, the Mark. Their commercial space is not rented. We don't hear anything about retail coming back. We've got a portion of our economy that is buying products online and having them everything shipped back to their house. We have no idea what portion of our economy has disappeared. It may be permanent, or it may be, just for an extended period of time. But that means that your commercial space downtown, which, the new downtown is basically the funk zone, and we've got all of those empty storefronts, those storefronts are too expensive. And places like San Diego are trying to rezone their mixed-use areas so that they can actually put residential on that first floor because they've got so many empty storefronts. What we're saying right now is that we're going to be fine with going ahead and making density higher in the central business district. We're not taking away any commercial space. Those commercial spaces, we have no idea what they're going to rent for, but they're probably not going to want to decrease the cost And then the residential units upstairs, at least from this one study, said that for each residential unit you had, it was going to cost an additional $11,000 to $19,000 per unit. And we're now talking about maybe putting parking, in lieu fees for parking. That's really there's not enough information for, because that's something else that we heard. We don't have enough information. Well, we don't have enough information about parking. We don't have a parking study. We don't have an economic plan to really understand what is going on with, our economy. We know it's in the dumpster, but we don't know exactly how to fix it. And you just can't fix it by rezoning the downtown, because the council member was correct. You have a lot of people who own property downtown under Prop 13, and you know what? They're just going to write whatever they can off with taxes, keep the storefronts vacant. They've been vacant for years in some cases. And that's not going to change. We should not be making any decisions right now regarding this until we actually have an economic plan and we've got a real parking study. The other thing that we have is we have no idea how many units downtown would it take to actually revitalize our central business sectors. How many units? Is it 2,000? 5,000? Yeah, maybe 5,000 units. So is our city ready to actually have 5,000 units downtown? Is that it? Is that the number? Or is it 2,500? Nobody knows, because no one's done a study. And our developers and our planning department should not be the people making these decisions. You need to hire someone to help us, a third party that's completely independent, that doesn't have a dog in the fight, to actually look at this. That is what we should be doing. Making all of these decisions right now does not help us. And let me remind you, we just got this study back that says for every 100 market rate units that we have built, we need 25 that are actually affordable. 25 units. How in the world are we actually going to make decisions without data, in real data? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so it's back to the task force for comments and possible motions. Mr. Olson, you want to start with comments? Items 1 and 2, exactly. Is your mic on? Is your mic on, Don?
Oh, sorry about that.
Repeat that, please.
Pardon?
Repeat that.
I support having one parking space for 2-bedroom units outside the CBD.
Okay.
And on the in lieu fee, I think we need to increase the 10,000 to some higher number. I don't know what that would be, but I think it should be higher.
10,000 feels a little low.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Murillo?
Thank you. I like the idea of 1.5 spaces for any unit larger than 700 square feet. That gives us a little more flexibility, right, Mr. Dayton? So it could be a 2-bedroom, it could be a 1-bedroom. Couldn't be a 3-bedroom, but
Pretty small.
really, okay, pretty tiny. And yes to 10,000.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Lodge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur with Ms. Murillo on the 1.5 spaces for 2 bedrooms. And on the fee, I think it could be higher, although just how it will be used to decrease the demand for parking spaces, I don't know. Obviously, it can't be used to create more parking spaces. Right. But I would say somewhere closer to 15,000.
So more than 10. Okay. Mr. Jordan.
I'm fighting a cold, and I actually heard you guys say two different things again. So I agree with Ms. Murillo that a 1.5 for anything over 700 square feet, but I heard Ms. Lodge agree with Ms. Murillo and say something totally different. So she did not.
I thought I was agreeing with her.
I thought you were agreeing with her too, but then you started talking about 2-bedroom units, and I'm just focusing on the 700 square feet. So I think there's some merit to saying build it smaller. You'll have less stuff, including a car potentially. Build it larger. You need some more parking. And I am like poised on the fence on the whole downtown parking, downtown development. It should give you should, anybody in this room should be waking up in cold sweats every night, wondering what State Street's going to look like in the next 20 years, and hoping that even though it seems the right choice to make is to put more people on the street down there by adding residential, but hoping to God that it doesn't look like Fifth Street in downtown San Diego in 20 years, which, if you haven't been there, that's the gas lamp district and is full of trinkets, bars, and restaurants. At some point, you have to wonder what the consequence is of putting, Bill Mahan said 1,000 a couple weeks ago, you just said 5, of putting those many residential units downtown and what they're going to need or want down there, and are they still going to want retail or not? And if they're not, if that continues the downward spiral of retail, what will be able to make money down there, and does that turn into bars and restaurants, and we lose I call it whatever you want, the retail character, whatever, State Street. I certainly don't have a crystal ball on what that would look like, but I think certainly the last 2 years makes the case that we don't really know what the consequence will be frequently. So in answer to the question on that next slide, I'm happy with 10,000 or 20,000. I would be much more concerned with having a mechanism to react to what these changes will be in a much more nimble and agile method. Just because we sneak a phrase in called adaptive management and then we enter on a 1.5 years worth of committee hearings leading to trying to get something done is not adaptive to me. It's slow and cumbersome and non-reactive and defensive. And so whatever that would look like in directing more residential down there, in having an in lieu fee, being able to buy down the parking, hopefully spurring more residential down there, hopefully keeping the character of a retail presence in downtown State Street. If it's not working, it shouldn't be 1,500 units and 2 years and another 1.5 years of committee meetings followed by whatever takes place after that. There needs to be a mechanism as part of this to help us react quicker. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Dominguez?
So I agree definitely with the part about this committee moving slow, and it's partly because, as people acknowledge, this is a very complicated industry. It's housing. It overlaps with transportation and the environment and retail. So it's slow, and I think part of the problem, and I risk repeating myself, is we don't have a clear sense of what the community wants, and I think we need to reboot our community planning process, whether it's a general plan or a specific plan or just a State Street plan. We need to figure out where we're going. And the answer to 5,000 was to a specific question: how many units would you have to add to State Street to start noticing an impact? I'm not saying that I want 5,000. That was just saying, hey, if you want to see an economic impact, 5,000 may be your floor. That doesn't begin to deal with affordable housing or workforce housing or where we want to see our city going economically or environmentally. Santa Barbara, and we have this horrible fire taking place down in Ventura. Santa Barbara, the Central Coast, is the worst place in California to build if you're an environmentalist. If you're here and you're looking for a better environment, putting more housing here where the water is the most expensive and environmentally difficult to get here, it's challenging to get here, doesn't make sense. We don't have a built-out, robust public transportation. Putting more people here doesn't make sense relative to downtown LA or downtown San Francisco, particularly in the Bay Area where they have robust public transportation. It's the best public transportation on the West Coast. They have much more water than we do. It makes sense if we're going to add people to California, we shouldn't be trying to put them in central coast of California. That being said, there are several reasons you want to add people. You want to have housing for your residents, people who grew up here, people who live here and are priced out of the market. You don't want to dislocate people. So there has to be a certain allowance for that and for legitimate economic growth, for sustainable economic growth. So when you look at downtown, you have to look at all these various factors, not just can we get someone to build here? You want a quality building, meaning is it going to enhance our society, enhance our neighborhood? So it is complicated, and I think we need the community to weigh in. So I'd definitely be for that. I don't want to see a single parking space added to our inventory in Santa Barbara. I think we have a lot of parking we're not taking advantage of. There's a lot of businesses, particularly in my district in the CBD, that have parking spaces that don't get used for months. So what we need to do is have a system where we inventory all the parking and we allow people to rent them out, much like Airbnb and Uber is sharing. We allow people to share their parking spaces for profit, and that'll increase the inventory. It increases the supply. So even if we have some increased demand short term, some of these parking spaces can go. So what I'd love to do is see us push forward much more fiercely with these initiatives, even if we have to hire some people in the short term. But I think it'll pay back in spades economically for the city. And again, safety is a primary issue here. What else was I going to say? Not only are we going slow, but while we're going slow, we're actually losing workforce housing units. There are units being demolished that are below market rent, and they're being replaced with the most expensive housing in town just because that's how housing works. It's the same reason people won't tear down a relatively decent commercial building on State Street to put in residential because it's still bringing in a decent amount of revenue. Really, you get new buildings coming in when the old building is at the end of its lifespan. So that's part of the real estate economics that we really need to study more and get people on board with. And I'm phrasing some of these things as answers, but these are all questions. The one question I can answer with certainty is, do we have enough information? No. So let me just make sure that I'm clear. When we have uncertainty, you want to be conservative. You want to err on the side of not hurting people, do no harm. So my concrete answer would be to agree to raise the parking to 1.5 for both the 2 bedrooms and the size 1,500, 700. I'm sorry, I'm doing math in my head. And for both of those bullet points, and with the connected idea of getting some parking programs to relieve some of the pain being felt by residents and businesses because of the areas where there aren't enough parking spaces. And then what was the other question? The
in lieu fee.
B.
In lieu fee, I would say let's start with $20,000 and see what happens from there.
Okay, thank you. And we are, next on our agenda is to talk about the bringing in the higher density into the CBD. That's kind of the, even if we don't get to grandfathering today, if we just get that'll be the meat of our next conversation. So, okay, so my comments on the 2 pieces before us are, I support it sounds like we have a pretty broad consensus on this one, and I agree with it. The 1 space for units less than 700 square feet and 1.5 spaces for units over 700 square feet. And then we, of course, we have the 2-bedroom, the 3-bedroom, 2 parking space requirement that's already on the books. But I think that's a good next place to go. We sidestep the 2-bedroom concept. We've seen such misuse of when it's 1 and 2 and studio and 1 and 2 bedroom units. Mr. Olson can remember back in the day of the variable density where we've got some 2,000 square foot studios out there of abuse of what's a 1 bedroom and what's a 2 bedroom. So the square footage I think is the best way to go, and it just it keeps it simple. And then I'm supportive of whatever the maximum number is that the accountants and the Constitution and the lawyers and all can get together to have be an in lieu fee. I wanted to at least talk a minute about. Well, let's see. We're going to go on to this CBD concept, and that's where I can talk a little bit more about the history. So, can we get a motion on? Mr. Rowell?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure you had this information before you start a motion. Member Dominguez had asked earlier what was the 2-bedroom count inside and outside of the CBD, and Renee was kind enough to get it to me. We have 50 projects outside the CBD, and there's 324 2-bedroom units. And inside the CBD, we have 17 projects with 139 2-bedroom units. So I thought you'd need that information before you made a motion.
Can you repeat that, please?
50 projects outside the CBD with 324 2-bedrooms. Inside the CBD, 17 projects with 139 2-bedroom units.
Okay, well, I'm ready. We're ready for a motion on these 2 items.
Mr. Chair, I move 1.5 spaces for any units over 700 square feet.
And then,
Second.
And then I'd ask that we also just include the reinforcement of the 1 space for less than 700 square feet.
Yes, I'll add that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, second.
All right, there's a motion and a second for the parking as we've discussed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, good. All right, then on the in lieu fee.
I move 10,000.
Okay. We have a motion for 10,000. Do we have a second? Okay, the motion dies for lack of a second.
I move for 20,000.
I second.
There's a motion and a second for 20. Okay. Let's see. Let's have a roll call on that.
I'm sorry, was there a second?
There was. Mr. Olson seconded.
So, Olson?
Yes.
Olson seconded. Sorry.
Oh, yes. On the motion, yes. Yes. I seconded the motion and
And you
vote
supported it?
yes.
No.
Yes.
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 Okay. All right. So for the moment then, we're finished with those items. We have that to send up to council. And then, as we discussed in the beginning of the meeting, we're going to reverse the order and discuss the concept of, do we allow, should we allow higher densities than medium high in the CBD? Should we be filling in the donut hole with more donut?
Mr. Chair, if
Ms.
I may. I'm really disappointed to have the order changed. This is like deciding, what are we going to do about State Street? Number 2. And I don't think we can do that here today. I think we can decide when we're going to require inclusionary housing. And that is the important thing. That is what is going to get us some affordability in the units. And I think the sooner we do that, the better. So,
well, and I would say that I appreciate the point there. And what we do also have is this. The next discussion that the Housing Task Force will have, as I recall, that's on our agenda is CBD. Is that not the case, Mr. Rowell? Don't we not have that as our, or is he?
Yes, that's the case.
Yeah. So certainly we could be saying, this is part of that CBD discussion. And I'm sort of, this is a conversation that we were having just a few minutes before this meeting. And so I really kind of correct myself in saying there's going to be a focus completely on CBD, and that this obviously is a critical piece of that. So I could change direction. I'm seeing nods from staff to change back to our original order, and also basically this CBD business really just becomes it is a core issue for the broader discussion. Ms. Murillo?
Mr. Chair, I guess I would argue the other way. One, because we've just come off of the charrette, and we have information and an energy going forward looking at our central business core. And the other issue is that the phasing in requirements, I think we have a basic disagreement about the vote that we've taken. We took one early on when Mr. Jordan wasn't here, where we voted to consider a cap, but keep in mind that there were a whole bunch of projects in the pipeline. And then we took another vote in September, and I think we need time for staff to really go back and listen to those two discussions and come back. So I would say we go ahead with your original adjustment, with all due respect to Commissioner Lodge, and talk about densities in the central business core.
Well, with that, I think that maybe we should just adjourn this meeting. No.
Could adjourn the meeting.
No, we have an hour and 15 minutes, and we're going to be able to. What are we going to be able to accomplish in that time frame?
So can I mess this up again and ask my earlier question? So, because I've already heard you say maybe we'll put something off to the next meeting, but we put off the discussion on the ranking 2 months ago to this meeting, and then it didn't happen this meeting. It's just kind of gone silent. Are we still looking to have that subject discussed at an HTF meeting? Right? I think it was.
You mean how to rank projects?
Correct. We 2 months ago, we deferred that off until today's meeting. And then when the agenda came out from today's meeting, it just wasn't there. And so is it gone? Are we not talking about it? Is it deferred off? What's the status of that?
Well, my understanding is this: we have what we're discussing today is the second half of what we were proposing to discuss last time.
Correct.
So we are just behind.
We're simultaneously kicking multiple meetings down the road.
We're grinding on
so
the
my
work.
question is, again, I'm uneasy with what I phrased as a la carte decisions when I see some of these decisions as potentially being part of a menu of merit ranking, and that we keep ignoring this merit ranking. So I guess I just want to know when we're going to look at this merit ranking and include that in this process.
Well, I see we got Mr. Buell moved up here, so that's a good sign.
Mr. Chair, members of the task force, the reason that we didn't consider the merit ranking today as previously anticipated is because we really didn't get through the full agenda last time. And so we wanted to provide the ongoing continuity that the task force had engaged in November to continue again in December. So here we are, and we're making really good progress in that. The anticipation, well, it'll be, as I was thinking about it, we would resume conversation of the ranking at the next meeting as previously anticipated for this meeting. But if it's the pleasure of the task force to take something else up, such as the CBD or whatever else it might be, we serve at your direction in that regard in setting future agendas.
Yeah, and at councils. And so we have those two topics then, ranking and CBD are sort of topics that council has already said that the task force would take on, right?
Correct.
So those will come next month. And of course, there could even be, as with the last with the last task force meeting, we could have continued that till a shorter period of time and not just made it part of the regular monthly meeting, but said, okay, we need to finish this meeting so we can do that next week or whatever. And of course, that's a miserable thing for staff and maybe for everybody, but at least we could be staying more on a schedule if you want to try and get through topics more quickly. So that's coming, and hopefully that and the ranking business all hooks up with, of course, the metering concept as well. And so all of that will be subject for conversations in January and thereafter.
Mr. Chair, if I might also add that the task force is aware that the state legislature adopted a number of, or the governor signed a number of bills recently that affect how the city approaches housing. And just today I was participating in a webinar with the League of California Cities with the staff from the city attorney's office. And that may also interplay as to how we approach the ranking. And I don't have any definitive answers, but it's going to be something that we'll be talking about with Mr. Vincent, who has been keeping you apprised of legal matters with respect to issues that you've been discussing. And so that will also be, we'll be revisiting on that to make sure that we have firm legal footing before we continue down that path.
Chair White.
Mr. Olson.
Will we be dealing with the phase-in requirements at the next meeting as well?
Well, I'll tell you what I'd like to do is I'd like to have a straw vote on who would prefer to be we have two items here, the phase-in and the medium-high density in CBD. I'm going to say who would prefer to be talking phase-in at this point as opposed to CBD? Can you just raise your hand? Okay, so there's four of us. All right, so then we will go with the phase-in as this discussion, and the medium-high density. I think that there's rationale for that, which says CBD is coming very soon. We know it's a high priority. We know the charrette is a big deal, and we look forward to that getting discussed in detail and mixing in the parking, the density, and the various uses all at the same time, maybe with some more great staff graphics at the same time. So staff then kindly kick us off in our hour and 12 minutes on the phase-in.
Okay, the question is on the phase-in requirements, what type of phase-in or grandfathering should the city consider for new housing and parking requirements? And if you recall in the past meeting, we asked that the stakeholders also be given an opportunity to weigh in on these questions. And I thought it'd be appropriate to let you know, based on the feedback that was written and received over the last few weeks, what the different options in the phase-in were that were suggested. We had four responses that said, grandfather or do not require on all projects in the current pipeline. That's one option. Require on all applications not accepted by staff. That was another option.
When you say accepted by staff, what does that mean?
I think they meant approved when they said accepted. Require on all projects not issued a building permit. There were two responses for that. Require on all projects not deemed complete. 3 responses. Require on all projects not deemed complete by a date certain, August 15th, 2017. There wasn't any information as to why they picked that date.
Did we
and then
meet
the
that
last,
day?
I'm sorry?
Was that not a meet? That was not a meeting date for us.
It didn't look like one.
Okay.
Require on all new project applications 9 months after adoption of the new requirement. So as you can see, there's anything from issuance of permit all the way to projects that haven't even been come in yet.
Right.
So that's the full range in front of you. That was with housing. With the phase-in of the parking requirements, there was much more of a view that these could be phased in much more immediately because the assumption was, and the feedback was that the parking requirement for the 700 square feet was, for most of the responses, they did not want that. So their view was the phase-in was going to be things like the in lieu fee and unbundling and things that were more favorable to the development. So,
Okay.
So that's what you have in front of you.
But we have the full range from off with their head to let them go free. And, yeah.
Mr. Chair.
Ms. Lodge.
Once again, the purpose of the whole AUD thing was that it was going to generate affordable, small A affordable units, which it has not. And I would urge that we go for requiring, and the staff, there was a recommendation of 10% of the units be small A affordable. But if you look at the AUD report, I'm sorry, the report on the numbers that was mentioned by Ms. Gott, I believe, the analysis of the nexus between priority overlay rental and how many units of other additional low-income housing they need, it generates. It's another 18.4 that are very low, low, and moderate affordability. And so what's happening is we are getting units built, like the Mark, for example, 89 units there, and they are all way over what we were hoping we would get. And they are, in addition, generating demand for more, or need for more affordable units. So I think that we should go to a higher percentage, at least 15 or 14%, and that it be applied, the requirement be applied to everything before that has not gotten a building permit. And that is going to generate a total of 56 affordable units out of the, if I figured correctly, out of the 729 in the test program.
Okay, so interesting concept there. I want to back up. I'm recalling in our council sessions that Mr. Kahlon at one point remarked or indicated, and I thought council supported, putting on, notifying developers that that requirements could change. Could you describe a little bit? Certainly, Mr. Olson might not know about that, and maybe even Mr. Jordan. But is that happening? And is there any? Did anything get followed up on that front?
Yes, Mr. Chair, you are correct in that the city attorney advised council that he would be bringing back a resolution for consideration that essentially put that established that the city council was in the process of looking at development regulations as they related to the AUD. I don't know where that is in process of coming back, but I do know that it's something that he intends to bring back, but I don't know where it is with regards to his other workload.
But it's not. I mean, we know they're buried, and that's just part of the mountain that's buried them. Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Mr. Chair, so could you unconfuse me again? So are we talking today about phase-in requirements for just the items we're talking about today, or are we back to talking about phase-in requirements for everything in the pipeline?
Ms. Lodge's comments were to the inclusionary and to what else? I guess Ms. Lodge didn't identify.
But we had a conversation once before about this, and was it continued about where in the pipeline to recommend that projects were free to proceed or could be burdened going backwards, so to speak? And my recollection is somebody came up with a date.
That was the date of the meeting, September 13th, in which a motion was passed saying that they would not, on the monitoring phasing part of it, that is the separate program, aside from the inclusionary
So
requirement.
what we're talking about today is only for the inclusionary?
What I'm talking about, yes, is only about the inclusionary. Well, and
Mr. Chair,
Let's
if I
ask
can.
staff, what did you imagine to be the pieces of the puzzle that would be part of this inclusion, grandfathering?
Yeah, that'll be a two-part answer, and let me go back to the question that Mr. Jordan asked. And you're correct that the task force did deliberate about establishing a threshold. That was in relationship to the cap, and so we're back on that cap conversation. That took place on September 13th, and so it wasn't in the context that we're talking about today. That was just limited to when should, if a cap is implemented, when should it? What is the threshold? The decision that you made was that anything submitted after September 13th. It was the date of that meeting. That was the decision that came out of this group. Now, the second part, in terms of what the task force is being asked to consider today, I'll turn over to Mr. Rao for clarification.
The question today is when to phase in the inclusionary requirement, which includes the in lieu fee, in addition to the parking in lieu fee, and the motions that you've just passed regarding parking. So the items in front of you are the inclusionary fee, the in lieu parking fee, and the change in the requirement on parking outside of the CBD for anything greater than 700 square feet. Those are, so the question is, you could make a different phase-in for the housing requirements and the parking. You could make them the same, and as you mentioned earlier, there's a full range of places that you could phase this in.
Okay.
All right.
So I guess my question to fellow task force members would be to maybe help me understand why the questions and answers and determinations we made for the cap as to when a project was so ingrained and invested in the system in that timeline that it should be exempt from the cap, why we would have different considerations for these other items. So if a project has proceeded that long and they've invested all that money and they've done it in good faith, and so we said you're not going to be part of the cap, why you could then pick a different time, backwards or forwards, to put these other burdens on them. I would like to hear more about that.
Oh, okay, maybe you should also describe what your position is.
Well, I still have a nice little picture that Renee drew for me. So you remember this one, don't you? Yeah. So, my understanding is there's no good definition of deemed complete. There's a pretty good definition of project approval. There's a definite definition of building permit, and there's no good definition of minimum submitted and accepted. And so on that timeline, a couple months ago, maybe 3 months ago, there were certificate of occupancies issued for one project, two projects maybe, of which one of them was 99 units. So 102 units. That was the mark and something else. We still might only have the mark and 6 more units in the whole city that have a certificate of occupancy. But between a building permit and minimal submitted accepted, there were over 650 units in the pipeline, and some of them had been there for a year and a half or 2 years. And so my recollection of the discussion for the cap relief or not relief was, at what point is there such an investment in both dollars and the process by a developer based on good faith that it just seemed unfair to go back and say, now you have to do these other things. And I think the fair thing to do in being fair would be it'd be an equivalent type of comparison, that it should be after that date or before that date, unless you can make the case why it isn't a burden an excessive burden for a project that has played by the rules up to that point.
Mr. Chair.
Okay, and I didn't get this before and this after. Are you saying then that the 9/13 date should be the cutoff point for the in lieu fee, the inclusionary requirement?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah. So they would be both of these are similar paths and considerations in my mind.
Good.
Mr. Chair.
Ms. Murillo?
Thank you. This is a question for Ms. Brooke and the staff. So my understanding is the AUD web page says deemed complete. So isn't that our standard then that we're going to hold to?
Mr. Chair and task force members, since we're talking about the subject of deemed complete, we do know when that time occurs for a project, and it's when a project has been deemed ready for the purposes of AUD, mostly because most of them go through a design review process. It's the time when the project is ready to be scheduled for project design review by the design board. So we have all the application materials we need. It's ready for that major action that a design board takes. And in your most recent statistics that we provide as part of your packet, we started breaking out that major heading of pending AUD projects. We now break that out into 3 different categories for you, and I think this was in direct response to the conversation we had probably at your August meeting or maybe September meeting. So we now track projects more closely, whether they're pending, they're pre-consultation or pre-application review. So they have not submitted an actual application to the city at that point. Pending, application accepted is it has come in over the counter, we've accepted it for processing. Pending, deemed complete, it might have gone to the design board several times as a conceptual review agenda item, but not until it's deemed complete is it actually ready for project design review. So that's a project that's pretty far along in the process. And then I think the others are self-explanatory. Those project approved and building permit issued, we've been tracking those for the whole period.
And you do know which ones were deemed complete as of September 13th?
We do.
Was that the date that we had chosen? That was the date of the meeting?
Yes, that was the date
we kind
you
of
chose.
arm wrestled about that, and we also said that city council, of course, when they take it up, can choose a different date if they so choose, but we needed to land on something while we were here. Okay, so you know which ones are deemed complete as of that date?
We do.
So then I'm in agreement with Mr. Jordan that they played by the rules and they knew what they thought they knew what the rules were. People are going to come up and say other things at the podium, and we'll have a discussion. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Olson?
Thank you, Chair White. Actually, I believe, and Ms. Brooks may be able to clarify this, at the September 13th meeting, when we made that decision, we talked in terms of projects that had been accepted, not deemed complete, but had been accepted, which is very different.
Yep.
And given the feedback that we got in our survey, I'm leaning toward withdrawing my support from September 13th and looking more at what the Housing Authority staff recommended, which was to grandfather in all projects that are submitted up to 9 months after the ordinance is adopted, recognizing that while they aren't in what we traditionally call the pipeline, they are certainly projects that have started. They've invested money. They've secured the land. They've started the design review process, not the review with the city, but the design process. They're in a pre-application mode based on the rules that are currently in the ordinance. So I would recommend that we consider for the affordability requirements that we're talking about for the new or for the amendment, the inclusionary and so forth. For those changes that would apply to projects submitted after 9 months following adoption of the ordinance. But I'm also recommending that we got to get to the nuts and bolts of this in terms of producing projects. I believe that the City Council needs to declare this as a special project, not this task force, but affordable housing as a special project, and direct staff to work collaboratively with housing authority staff, people self-help, any other nonprofit, maybe even an employer, to actually identify a site or maybe several sites, securing that land, starting the process of design, putting together a financial plan for the project. When you look at our track record as our affordable, capital A, affordable housing inventory, none of those projects were developed by private developers. They were all developed by nonprofit organizations, with one exception, and that was in the late 80s when the redevelopment agency did a bond issue and worked with private developers and provided lower interest rate loans for rental projects for a period of time. But in reality, while we may feel that what we're doing here is going to result in a lot of affordable housing, it's not going to happen that way. If we're really serious about putting some units on the ground, it's going to take some hard work by staff working with the housing authority or people self-help, identifying sites, figuring out what we can do, put together the financing, and go through the process. And by doing that, we have something ready to use the money that might be coming from the ordinance. Also, the money that might be coming down trickling down from the state, from the whatever that funding source was. But I think we need to be realistic in terms of how we can do this and make it happen in a substantive way.
Special project.
Special project.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Well, you want to,
So here's the language from that motion in September, and you're right. My recollection now too is that we didn't really have a deemed complete time in August. So it was Mario Campanella and passed 4-2 that recommend to City Council that applications submitted to and accepted by the city as of September 13, 2017 are not subject to a future limit on the number of units developed under the AUD program.
And the intent of that was to protect those applicants who had already...
your mic.
Okay. Sorry again. The intent of that was to protect the applicants who had submitted who had invested significant dollars toward developing a project.
Mr. Chair?
Hang on,
Oh.
let's see what others want to speak. And come back and.
Okay.
Any thoughts?
I think in order to be consistent and honor the spirit of that agreement, I would agree we should keep it September 13th and application accepted and include all of the new add-ons that we're talking about today.
I'm not getting that exact. So September 13th, application is accepted, and what? Everything's grandfathered that it was accepted before the 13th.
Correct. So if you've applied after the 13th, or your application was accepted, to be more exact, after the 13th, then you're subject to these rules.
Okay. All right. So Dominguez is accepted.
Renee, is that how you remember it? Because I specifically remember in our meeting that we had this gap with no line on deemed complete. We had this gray area of deemed complete in August or September. There was not a line in the sand where you deemed complete. Is that right?
Mr. Chair and Task Force Member Jordan, we are more explicit now in making that action.
Right. Okay, now you are.
We are, but we could have always gone back and made that determination retroactively. I could tell you at any time when a project was deemed complete, but we are now going forward making that a clear, hard line in communication to the applicant.
Okay. So I just want to make the point that those of you who are stuck on this deemed complete thing versus not deemed complete, there was a reason that phrase was not used 3 months ago.
Right. All right. So any other comments? Okay. Ms. Lodge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, frankly, I'm shocked that a member of this task force would want to wait 9 months beyond the point where the September 13th date to apply any of this. The whole, once again, I go back to the purpose of the high priority increased density was to generate workforce affordable housing.
That wasn't my intent. I'm not sure if you're misinterpreting what I said. I think it's only Mr. Olson who has that opinion.
Oh, well, I wasn't responding. No, I'm responding to Mr. Olson. And, you know, what we're getting, we were hoping to get, I was dumb, I was naive, I believed the developers when they said they would develop rental housing that rented from $1,200 to $2,400 a month with the higher densities. That's what they said that after the design charrette. And that was part of what gave me the idea. Okay, let's see, does that really happen? And it's supposed to be only 250 units. And in the meanwhile, we've got what, a total of 729 or whatever, yeah, over. And we're not getting any affordability. We're getting instead more demand for more affordable housing at all levels, low income, very low income, as well as moderate income. We're getting increased congestion on our streets. We're getting the community's getting no benefit. Why not be fair to the community? I'm not that concerned about being fair to developers. You know, they're business people. They get into this. They know there's a certain amount of risk. And we know that a lot of them never even get built, and although they've invested all this money. I think it's time the community gets something out of this, and that we should have the requirements for the inclusionary housing, which we have had, by the way, for years for sale housing. How many units do we have in for sale housing condos that are inclusionary, Mr. Rawl? Do you remember offhand?
Our owner-occupied affordable program's 461 units.
And that was all.
It's not all due to inclusionary.
Oh.
But inclusionary has worked on occasion. We have some units in lotteries, and they're being built. It's a hit and miss.
And this is the only way, by imposing this requirement, that we're going to get anything that looks like it. And so I just can't understand why some of my colleagues are so interested in protecting the developers. Why not protect the community?
I'm going to weigh in here in concert with that. I agree with Ms. Lodge, which probably just no one's surprise. I want to add a couple things. So first of all, I want to get back to the application, the deemed complete business. This was the tool that I had worked with in my career as a planner. I got a letter from the planning department that said your application is complete, and that was a very big deal. It was a landmark day for a project, and so I didn't even know that didn't exist for the city of Santa Barbara. I just thought that was even state law or whatever. But it sounds like staff is clarifying that or making that a harder line as a result, perhaps as a result of the conversations that we've had in this room. And I do think it's to have these benchmarks is just really important in projects as they mature. So I don't think that needs too much comment there. But so many things are going on here. One thing that Ms. Lodge did not say, and that I know that Mr. Dominguez has mentioned repeatedly, you also have the destruction of affordable housing that's going on as part of this process, which is to take out the old units that are sitting on. And there's no vacant there's hardly any vacant property left in this town. So wherever a project goes, it's usually taking something out, and usually something funky. And if something's funky, it's usually renting either a commercial or a residential at a lower price. So that adds to the concern. Another piece of this that's going on is the housing authority no longer can compete for buying property. The AUD program has taken out all of the nonprofits from participating in the marketplace. They're gone. And so that's a concern. I mean, and land prices. We've had all these had the study done about land costs as being as part of the return on investment. These people bought this land at lower prices. The AUD comes along. Prices have risen. They've doubled since the crash. So now land is now at such a high price that it's only available for upscale development. So I'm much more in Ms. Lodge's camp on the building permit is the place. It's a place where we have a legal footing. I mean, that's an important ingredient from my perspective to impose these additional costs. And as Ms. Lodge says, this is what the community gets back. So that's my perspective, and for whatever good that's going to do from here forward. Ms. Murillo?
Can I make a motion, or do we still have public comment?
We have two speaker slips here, so let's hear them.
Can I just make a comment on your funky comment? I think sometimes when something is knocked down and something old is knocked down and something new built, that it's also substandard. And a lot of these properties are family owned. The family wants to do something different with the property. They're ready to make changes to their property. And under variable density, we were getting overly expensive condominiums. So some of you may not believe that the AUD is better than what we were getting under variable density, but this is speaking to the property rights of people who say, I want to do something different with this, something that's falling down maybe sometimes too. So unless we're looking at each individual case, we can't just make a blanket statement that it's some cool old place that's getting knocked down and we're losing affordable housing. That's a generalization that I hear. And so Mr. Dominguez is going to give me a rejoinder on that one. Unless we've looked at every single property, we can't make generalizations about what was there before.
Okay.
Can I just add in? I actually did go out and look at every single one of the properties. I think in the 6th month of my term of office, I took out Frank, who's one of our housing advocates, on my second trip around, and I knocked on all the doors and I talked to all the residents. So I did actually do what you recommended. I would certainly recommend that everyone do that. And none of these people, very few of them knew what was happening. none of them had an idea where they were going to go. They were mostly Hispanic families, a lot of monolingual Spanish families. There was also several Anglo families. There was a guy who was a small business owner who used his driveway to park his vehicles for his business and was no longer going to be able to have that luxury. So not only in that case would his family be pushed out of town, but then his business. So there are very serious consequences.
I'll
You're
take
absolutely
that
right.
tour. I'll double check on that.
Okay, let's have our public comment now. We have Anne Marie Gott, followed by Lucas Zucker.
Chair and Housing Task Force. First of all, I was that person that actually said August 15th as the date because that was the date that we actually had the cap for the AUD. And if I could amend that, answer now, it would be building permit because I was under the impression that deemed complete actually meant that they had received final approval from one of the boards, not that you would just had your paperwork in. Someone just mentioned something about property rights. You have no property rights until your rights vest. Your rights do not vest until you get approval. And everyone has known for over a year that there were going to be changes made to the AUD. Just because our attorney has not, followed through with that resolution does not mean that people do not know that there are changes. People know that there are changes. And we're absolutely right here. We need housing. But we do not need housing that actually makes it unaffordable for the people that work here to live in those units. And we don't need housing that's going to be destroying, tens of in numbers of affordable units to produce housing that is only affordable for the top 20%. Our taxpayers are paying to subsidize the development of these particular projects. That is ridiculous. We're talking about giving parking spaces in the downtown district to market rate units. That's ridiculous. If you guys want to do something about the central business district, go ahead and just rezone the surface street parking, lots and have that for affordable housing. Just rezone that and see what you get.
All right. Your time is up.
I don't have 2 minutes? I have 4 minutes.
Oh, I didn't see Dalbella with you. Okay.
You got to add another 10 seconds there. We talked about the, Chairman, Commissioner Lodge talked about the AIA. You guys were sold a bill of goods in 2013 regarding what people were going to be able to develop things for. I think that we just heard yesterday that you're going to get sold a bill of goods again if you guys actually move forward because you really, really have no idea how you're going to be able to control those costs. And yeah, you can add some inclusionary, but we're going to lose a lot more because like I said before, we need an economic plan. We also need to really look at the issues with the new state housing laws. If we don't get units on the ground for our moderate income earners, which we have 13 units of, 13, and we need 801, if we do not get units for them, we're going to lose local control from the state. That's what we're going to lose, local control. So if we think that some of these ugly units like the Mark on Upper State are bad now, it's only going to get worse. Because if we lose local control, no one is going to be able to contest anything. As long as they meet certain guidelines, they're going to be able to build. That is what we are risking if you guys don't actually have every single unit that has a building permit and allow those to move forward without any of these, other restrictions. We should be looking at everyone who does not have a building permit, at least as of the middle of August, to have the additional parking requirements, the additional impact fees. We should reduce any of the, we should increase our cost recovery, and more importantly, we should be charging them impact fees, but the impact fees at the most, the highest level that we can actually get, because we shouldn't be leaving any money on the table.
Thank you.
All
right, Mr. Is it Zucker or Zucker?
Zucker.
Zucker. Okay. And then Mr. Gray will be the last speaker.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Just want to speak in support of not grandfathering in everything. I mean, I think the biggest concern for us, for CAUSE, is just that we've got this big amount of units in the pipeline, and then that's going to really taper off with the cap that was approved by council. And I know there's some questions about how state housing law will affect that cap, but at least in terms of the policy we have now, we have essentially 1,000 units in the pipeline, and then a trickle to 125. And so if we don't apply things like inclusionary housing retroactively, then we're losing a huge amount of affordable units that we could be getting. CAUSE is strongly supportive of, I know in the last task force meeting, this group made a motion for 10% or better. We'd really like to see 15% at council. But imagining if it was an only 10% inclusionary housing requirement on only 125 units a year, I mean, that is such a small amount of units compared to the need of over 7,000 people on our wait list at the Housing Authority. We've really got to get as many units as we can, and applying it retroactively, we'd like to see it applied to anything that doesn't have a building permit already. And I'd like to say I think that developers accept a certain amount of risk in building projects, right? You start to build a project, and who knows? I mean, toxic dump could be built next to it, or a beautiful park could be built next to it. There's state housing law can change. There's all kinds of things that can change. And so, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Gray.
Again, Cameron Gray, representing Community Environmental Council. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. With regard to the phase-in for inclusionary, in lieu, and other parking requirement changes, this issue is very interwoven with what's going to happen with the cap. And it does sound like there is some uncertainty. I want to echo what Lucas said about if that cap carries forward, I would hope that all of the projects that have not received a building permit, that they are held to these new requirements, because really the community has this urgent need for affordable and inclusionary housing. And I am in full agreement with Commissioner Lodge about the question of fairness. I think what is fair for this community is for these developers who, I think they got a good deal. I think it's why we see the large volume of applications coming through this program, to be held to this standard that if they're going to build in this community, that they provide some level of affordable housing, so that people who work here can live here, and we can have a robust, vibrant, well-connected community character. So, just want to, again, thank you for the opportunity to comment on that. Happy to hear more dialogue about this moving forward, and interested to see what will happen with the cap that was placed in September.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Chair White.
Mr. Sankoff.
Oh, I'm sorry.
One last speaker, yeah.
Yes. Hi, thanks so much in advance for your time. My name is Stanley Tsankoff, and I live and work here in the city. Just like to briefly echo Lucas and Cameron spoke before me. It's really important that we adopt these new inclusionary housing policies for the 1,000 or so units that are already in the pipeline, and not just the 125 or so per year. This is an extraordinarily significant opportunity, and I think we'd be remiss to miss it. As you very well know, the housing policy decisions that are in front of you are significant. They help shape the values and character of our city, and I believe that this is a common sense and just decision to make. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so here we are. We have a half hour left, and comments from our
Yes, Chair White, thank you.
task force.
David, the inclusionary on the ownership side of our inventory, how many of those units were actually developed by private developers? I would guess that it's a handful, that the majority of those
40, maybe.
were developed by nonprofit organizations.
Right.
Santa Barbara Community Housing Corporation, Homes for People.
El Patio is that's a rental. Never mind. I think it's.
And
We have a total of 40 units that were developed with the inclusionary program. We're still trying to determine your question regarding private developers or not. I'm not sure if we have that.
Mr. Chair and Task Force Member Olson, I'm referring back to the 2016 General Plan Implementation Report, where we had a paragraph or two on inclusionary housing development to date. So this is last year's information, but at that time, the inclusionary housing ordinance had produced 9 units. Strictly through the ordinance, there were many that paid an in lieu fee.
That's right.
We had also produced some moderate or middle income households units to that income levels through lot area modification, so different process. Also, during that, in the recent 10 years, we had the units at 535 East Montecito Street, which was a different type of arrangement, but those are, I think, at
Price restricted condos.
Price restricted, right, that's right. It's price restricted instead of income restricted. So inclusionary housing program has produced about 9 units so far. So that's private developer proposed units.
yeah.
Starting from when?
From your mic.
The ordinance was adopted in 2004.
Your
Yes.
mic is
And we've collected approximately $700,000 in inclusionary fees.
Yeah.
So it's
But there are 13 or 14 in Chapala 1, there are 7 or 8 in Paseo Chapala, it's 15 right there. That were done by private developers.
I believe some of those we acquired through the developer asking for a lot area modification. So with that, the decision maker, in order to make the findings for the lot area modification, the developer had to provide some affordable units. So it wasn't through the inclusionary housing program, because those were proposed around the 2002, 2003 era. Probably they were grandfathered in before inclusionary housing was adopted.
Actually, Chapala 1 was given land from the redevelopment agency.
that's right. Okay.
And in lieu of that, they had to provide a number of units, affordable units.
Interesting.
Anyway, well, I guess what I'm hearing is that people our task force members aren't interested in going to the 9-month approach. How about going to, upon adoption of the ordinance, applications that are submitted up to adoption of the ordinance are grandfathered in?
Well, that's.
I'm not clear on that.
Well, he's just saying, rather than 9 months after the adoption of the ordinance, he's saying at adoption of the ordinance. So he's conceding his 9-month
Okay,
tail.
but where are we now? When would that be?
More than 9 months from now?
More than, well, it would be after the ordinance is passed.
When the
Oh,
council adopts it.
Right.
So,
Time in the future.
A time in the future. So, Ms. Maria, so that's
Yeah.
your view, and that's a proposal for people to consider. All right. Ms. Murillo?
I appreciate where you're coming from with that, and also the speakers who are looking for more affordable units. You've been here, a lot of you, watching us arm wrestle is my verb, trying to get to a place that gives us community benefit. And I would like to make a motion, because we had talked about it at length, and
I hope that you'll let people, each person have a word here on this before, and then I would be glad to give you the first opportunity to make a motion.
that sounds good.
Or she makes the motion, we all agree on it. 'Cause we have one more thing to deal with.
And if
We're
we
not
go-
going to be dealing, this is it. We're down to the,
And if we go quick, we might be able to get to the next item? No, probably not. What Jason's saying, yeah. So you don't want me to make a motion?
I want you to I would ask that you comment you will have the first opportunity to make a motion.
Thank you. I'm still in agreement with the conversation that we had a moment ago about grandfathering in the projects that were accepted by staff as of September 13th. And keep in mind that the rule of thumb, Ms. Brooke, is a third of those will get built, right? So that not everything is going to get built. For those of you who are afraid of too much getting built or too much of a loss of the affordable opportunities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other comments, Ms. Lodge?
Well, I made them before, but once again, we're simply losing any opportunity for, well, it would be the 56 units that, okay, forget about them, that we could get. And that would be reasonable to ask for.
How do you get to the 56 units?
There are 299 thank you. 299 up to project approved, and then another 279 there. So that's 29 and 27 is 54.
I see. Okay. But out of the 1,000 units in the system.
Well, this is just the priority list.
Okay.
I mean, it would be more, adding in all of the AUD.
Right. Okay. All right.
Sorry. Thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you. Jordan, any other pearls?
Well, I'm still unconvinced to change my mind. I agree with Ms. Murillo on that prior timeline date.
Okay.
I bite my tongue, but I won't, and she can kick me all tomorrow afternoon under the dais at Planning Commission. But when you there's nothing that I don't agree with about the two of you and what you're saying in concept. But when you say that a part of that justification is we're not getting affordable housing, Renee can correct me, but that's two projects. One of them 99 units and one of them 6 units, and maybe it's 3 projects now, whatever it is up to date. And one of those projects is obviously obscene. So there is nothing on the ground yet to make a blanket statement to say we're not getting affordable housing. Affordable housing may appear out of some of these. I still have concerns with the whole concept. I give it, and I agree your guys' concerns are valid concerns, but just as a developer could stand up there and say, we're going to solve all your problems, and I would say, yeah, right. Also, I say, yeah, right, when you say we're not getting affordable housing, because there's nothing out there to measure that with yet. It's not true. It's not a truism yet. So I think being cautionary and fair at the same time is the answer, and I think we had that discussion a couple months ago, and I would like to see us continue to honor the investment, honor the carrot that we put in front of everybody, and work on a future fix. So I'm still in agreement with what we talked about before.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Mr. Dominguez?
I want to start by asking Commissioner Lodge, so is your suggestion for the motion to be September 13th, but use project approved or deemed complete as of September 13th, as opposed to one up application accepted? Right. So my comment would be...
Your mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. It would be up to building permit is issued. Everything in the pipeline
Okay.
is up to that point.
Well, I would, after hearing all the comments, I think maybe that might be a little soft. The current proposal, or the current, what seems to have majority acceptance, which is just cutting it off at application accepted versus one of these 4 other benchmarks. So, and at the end of the day, the council is going to decide. So I think what we're doing now is just giving them kind of a starting point. So I would, trying to craft a compromise, and I'll let Ms. Maria state the motion, but I would say let's just go one down from deemed complete. It's only going to add 1 or 2 more projects in, but I'll yield.
Accepted.
Okay.
Down to deemed complete. So if you're I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. Yeah, if you're deemed complete by September 13th, then you'd be grandfathered in.
No. Okay. All All right, so we have the two hardcores here. We have, it sounds like Ms. Murillo and Mr. Jordan are kind of on the same page. They've lost Mr. Dominguez. He's tougher. He's tougher than they are and softer than we are. So, which is before Ms. Murillo makes a motion, I'll say where this is going. Is it going to be 3 months, 6 months, or a year? It's going to be back to a compromise. This is the very conversation people sitting in this room, and I bet you some of the people sitting in the audience were sitting in this room 6 years ago, whatever it was, trying to hammer out, and Ms. Lodge was here, hammering out what the compromise is going to be. So we have the range of views here. We're going to have a range of views on council going forward, and it will be a compromise. So I do ask that all of you, that the colleagues that are here in the room and then going forward, keep your compromise hat on, because this is going to be an exercise in flexibility. And the opportunity is here, and I can appreciate the concerns that each of you are bringing forward. But that's just the spirit that this will need to get, will need to be applied to this effort. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. Well, I will play the John Campanella card to try to convince Councilmember Dominguez. He wrote us a comment letter. I think he's in Italy, somewhere wonderful.
High density.
Okay. And he says he feels that the time and expense involved and the lack of projects completed or ready to start construction, we need to let projects with applications accepted by staff. Mr. Dominguez, I'm reading this for your benefit. Okay. Accepted by staff go forward prior to the inclusionary housing or impact fee. So Mr. Campanella is also of the mind of what we were talking about a few minutes ago, that we should grandfather in at that cutoff. People put together their investors, their project, they designed the project, they came to the city, and Ms. Brooke had confirmed that was not a bad place to start. So I move that we grandfather in the projects that were accepted by staff as of September 13th of this year, right? It was this year. And exempt them from the new requirements.
Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, there's a motion, second. You need a clarification?
Yes, I need a clarification. So what would not be covered by the new thing? Everything's deemed complete, projects approved, obviously those with building permits, but just pending application accepted.
Ms. Burke, can you help us?
You're looking at your stats chart.
Yes, ma'am.
So if the wording is similar to how it was for the potential cap, and it's a recommendation to council that applications submitted to and accepted by the city as of September 13th, 2017 would not be subject to these future inclusionary housing or parking requirements. We would have submitted to and accepted by. So sorry, I'm just...
So it's pending application accepted.
That's the cutoff date you're talking about. So everything that's been deemed complete or project approved, building permit issued, would not be subject to these inclusionary housing requirements or parking requirements. We have only, looking at your chart, 7 projects that have not been accepted. Now, that's as of November 7th. If I go back to September 13th, I have a chart. There were 9 projects at that time that had not been accepted by the city for a total of 134 units. Everything else had either been accepted or was further along in the process.
Thank you. Are you satisfied, Commissioner Lodge? I mean, I know you're not
Well, no.
happy, but are you?
No,
Did we
I'm still
answer
not
your
gonna vote
question?
for it, but yes, you answered my question. Thank you.
Accurate. It's just, it's just, yeah. Okay, so we have a motion. Mr. Jordan seconded it. So let's have a roll call vote.
Task Force Member Olson,
In the spirit of compromise, yes.
Task Force Member Murillo,
Yes.
Task Force Member Lodge, Task Force Member Jordan,
Yes.
Task Force Member Dominguez, and Chair White.
No.
To make a motion. I'd like to move that we recommend that staff bring this to council with all due haste in the new year. This agenda item.
I'm
starting with this one.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
And the reason being just to give you.
Simply bring it to council without a vote of the housing task force? Is that?
Because council hasn't dealt with the inclusionary aspect. So I think the sooner they can deal with it, even if it's just sending it to us or another body, the better. Because otherwise staff's going to invest a lot of time and it could be for naught if council doesn't approve or have substantive direction.
Okay.
Okay, there is a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
There's a motion and a second. I would add this bit if this does pass, and that is that there's a real difference in these pieces between the physical and the financial. And so people coming in with projects that have different parking requirements, that's a bigger deal in terms of the maps and such, whereas the money is just the money. And obviously it's a big deal, but at least if somebody has to pay more to get a building permit, that's different than having to redesign the project in order to make it right. So that could be a place of conversation in the future on what pieces of this go forward and what pieces don't. All right. So
May I ask a question about the inclusionary piece? So we took a preliminary vote the consultant recommended 10%, and we said 10% perhaps better. Am I remembering that correctly? But the public is urging us to go a little higher. So you urging us at the council level to go higher? How did we leave that, Mr. Buell? It's at least 10, right?
I think the consultant said it could go to 20, didn't he?
Well, the recommendation out of the consultant was 10, only in that they were trying to look at a return on cost that would still be very conservative in the favor of producing projects. Obviously, if you moved to 15, the return on cost was still ahead of 5%. So he was trying to make a conservative recommendation. He did say you could go to 15%.
Well, let me ask you about that. So if it goes to 15, however, then that our proposal would have to be reviewed by the Housing and Community Development?
There's a state housing law that sets a 15% inclusionary cap where they would look at the research and the studies that we did in order to establish that 15% level. So it's a very good point, it would put the eyes and ears of HCD on that 15%. So
We want that?
Heavens no.
Heavens no.
14 and 7.
I would say
sounds like.
I would say you probably want to steer away from that at this time. I mean, obviously, I'd like to see the highest percentage of inclusionary, but 15% does put you under the microscope for HCD. It is that trigger level where you have to have a study, which we've done, but you also are subject to any review by their audit that says, well, what is the approach you used in your studies to establish that 15%? We have all that background information, but to play it safe, to your point, 15% should maybe just lower than that and higher than 10.
14?
Yeah.
You can come up with any figure. Obviously, a fraction of a figure is probably not a good idea.
Well, it sounds like we're tied because we're only 6, and so we're just sending it up to the city council, and you'll have to do a pretty extensive presentation, I think, to catch everybody up on it. Right. And it'll be in the new year, right? It's not going to be this year. Wow. Mr. Buell, I'm sorry.
Anyway,
Mr. Buell.
well, so we have a motion to send this to council at this point on the table. And we have this notion of that the inclusionary questions were asked about, well, could the inclusionary go up some? The short answer is yes. And it sounds like a 14% number. Your point, I think, probably will gain some traction in terms of it should be below 15 because it does trigger more state review. So
we're talking about kicking this up to the city council, and the alternative would be continuing it to the next incarnation of what the housing task force is going to be in the new year.
Yes, I would. That's another option. Okay, so we have the kick up to council motion on the table.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask the maker of the motion if he would make part of the motion that the council consider 14% inclusionary. Would that?
Just a point of correction. It is actually more than 15%. I was wrong. I thought it was 15% or more. It's
Okay.
more than 15%. So you could do 15%.
Okay.
I stand corrected.
I'm not actually making a recommendation of what number. I'm just asking that it gets to council sooner than later for 2 reasons. One, obviously, the sooner council addresses it, the sooner we have affordable housing, if that ends up being the output. And then also in terms of fairness to businesses, the sooner that the council decrees something, the more serious that community is going to take it. And they'll hopefully be more fair about their whether they come to us and say, hey, this is too soon, too fast or not. But the sooner we deal with it and can put them on notice, the better off everyone is. And again, I'm not asking for it by a certain date. I'm just instructing staff that, hey, can you, if there was something else that was a higher priority, maybe move this one up. You know, whether they bring it in January or next December, I mean, it's up to staff, but it's just sending a message that the task force resolved that this should go back to council for another look-see.
Mr. Chair, and one more question to staff. So would this make sense going to the city council without us also making a recommendation on the density in the central business district? I know they're not exactly the same thing, but it's all the same party.
I'll tell you, I'll share my thoughts, and I also want to start off by just clarifying. We can definitely go and convey a message to the city council with respect to what your decision is or what your recommendation is going forward on any aspect of what it is that you're considering. In the case of much of what we're talking about here today and previously, we're talking about amending the zoning ordinance. And so we would be going to council with your recommendation to initiate a zoning ordinance amendment. That starts a process where staff would take it back to the Planning Commission, the Ordinance Committee, then back to the City Council. So as much as I can appreciate the desire for haste, I want to make sure that there's a clear understanding of what that means. We would not have something on the books once council gets this on, let's say on February 1st or whatever that is.
Well, Mr. Buell, it might...
Let me say one thing, that how this task force has worked so far. We've had 2 iterations of council charging this group with doing things. And so it's been we've been making sausage in increments. And so this would be the next check-in, and it's of course opportune with a new council and so forth, so that you start to see what are the next charges that this task force is going to take on. And we've talked about CBD and ranking are 2 pieces that are now leftovers from what this council has instructed this task force to do. And Mr. Dominguez is suggesting that this piece get the piece about grandfathering get looked at and that start to get clarified so that people aren't spinning their wheels with meetings that are going nowhere, but rather, okay, this is a fundamental direction that council is willing to go, and then moving forward with that. So it's what Mr. Dominguez is asking for is consistent with what has happened so far in 2 rounds. Would that be a fair characterization from staff that you've gone to
Yes.
council for this list of tasks to do, and not the whole menu, but something. So I think it's a reasonable way to attack it, and of course it's introducing the new council to the whole issue, which is obviously going to be a big one to take on.
And there will be other changes, zoning changes separate from the density. So we'll have to do zoning changes sooner and later. Is that right? So it's okay that we didn't.
Because they're slow.
Okay.
Environmental review, supermajority, planning commission, task force conceivably. It's going to take a while.
We've done our best.
Yeah. So anyway, I would be supporting the motion. So we have a motion. Who seconded it?
Ms. Lodge.
Oh, I did.
Lodge,
I
yeah.
did.
Sorry. All right. So
Motion.
all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay.
Just as a point of clarification for staff, I'm sorry, but
No.
the maker of the motion, just want to make sure we have this right for our record.
That you come back with this agenda item. That you come back with this agenda item to council as hastily as possible to check in with council and make sure you're headed in the right direction. And obviously, as staff, you're allowed to bring anything you want to council, so you can add things in if you're concerned that you could be spinning your wheels with a brand new council. You know, after we appoint the new Ms. Murillo's replacement, we're going to have 3 brand new council members, and so things could change pretty dramatically. So it's probably worth to be overly inclusive, but this motion is just focused on this agenda item.
Got it.
And this task force is going to be different too. Right. Okay.
And Mr. Chair, to that point, it should be when we have a full contingent, it should be a 7-member council that we bring it to, so that there's a tiebreaker, right? And that the West Side representative gets to weigh in on it, because it needs 5 votes, right?
Right.
To initiate a zoning amendment requires 4 votes. To
Implement.
the ordinance requires 5.
Ah, okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, okay. So
Before you adjourn, I have
Yeah.
one comment.
Okay.
Was there anything else you were going to cover?
Nope.
I just wanted to point out we're going to have a different configuration, largely because Bendy won't be here, Mr. White. And we've really appreciated your chairmanship of this committee. Obviously, as Mr. Gray said, this is a very complicated issue with lots of strong opinions by everyone in the community, and you've managed to herd cats up here with the 7 of us and bring decades of experience, so not only substance, but also helping deal with personalities and politics. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it's a great group, and good luck. I'll be around. And this meeting is adjourned.